My name's Jake Holloway. I was born and raised in Southern Oregon, in a small logging town called Westridge. It's the kind of place where folks leave their doors unlocked and spend more time outdoors than in. I'm 42 now, and I've been working in the woods since I was 19. Long days, heavy boots, and the smell of pine have been part of my life for as long as I can remember. I was what you'd call a woodsman, working everything from tree marking to equipment repair to small-scale timber operations. The man who taught me almost everything I know, my boss of over 15 years, passed away early last winter. His name was Dale Carter. Dale wasn't just my boss. He was a mentor, the kind of man who believed in doing things right and earning your keep. No one messed around on Dale's crew, and he had a way of seeing through you when you weren't giving something your all. When he died, it was like a big old tree falling in the forest. Quiet, slow, and with a hole left behind that didn't seem to fill. After the funeral, everything changed. The company he ran got sold off. Some guys left town. Some retired early. I didn't want to stick around either. My wife had left years ago, no kids, and I figured I'd take a break from it all. I still had access to a piece of land, Dale, and I used to camp on when jobs took us out that way. Deep in the Fremont-Winema National Forest, off some logging road nobody used anymore. It was peaceful there. No cell service, no roads, just quiet woods and creeks and the occasional elk wandering by. I packed up a week's worth of gear and planned to spend 10 days out there alone, just like Dale and I used to do after a long season. It was mid-September. Weather was cool but dry. I loaded up my old F-250 with the essentials: tent, camp stove, tarps, plenty of canned food, tools, and my rifle. Not because I was hunting. I brought the rifle because there were still cougars out there, and I'd had one too many close calls to take chances. I left town around 6 a.m. and took the old road up into the mountains. By 11, I had the truck parked near a closed-off service path, the one that led to the clearing we used to camp in. I hiked the last 2 miles in, my boots crunching over dry pine needles and twigs. Not a soul out there, just whined through the trees and the low whistle of distant birds. The spot hadn't changed. The fire pit was still there, a circle of blackened stones around a pile of ash and half-burned logs. A few beer cans we'd crushed years ago were half buried under leaves. I cleared it up, pitched my tent near the base of a big fir, and sat down to make some coffee. That first day was quiet. I walked down to the stream, saw deer tracks and some raccoon prints, cut some small dead limbs to keep the fire going. I had a little radio that ran on solar power, and I kept it on low while I sat around just for some background noise. It was almost too quiet otherwise. I turned in around 9 p.m., belly full of beans and crackers, the fire dying down to glowing orange embers. That night, I slept light. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the brush would pull me up just enough to open one eye and listen. Years in the woods had trained my ears to pick up the difference between an animal walking and something else. But it was just the usual sounds, no big movements, no twigs snapping in strange patterns. I figured it was a deer or some raccoon sniffing around the fire pit. The next few days went much the same. I'd wake up, heat some coffee over the fire, then spend the day hiking the woods, sometimes tracking animals just for fun. I didn't have a phone with me, didn't bring any GPS, just an old map, compass, and instinct. I kept a journal in my backpack, and every night I wrote down a few things: where I'd been, what I saw, weather, and anything odd. Day 4 was when I noticed something strange. I was hiking northeast of the camp, up toward an old burned Scardale and I used to visit. On the way back, I noticed boot prints on the trail. Not mine. These were fresh, pressed deep in the soft dirt, wide tread pattern, like combat boots. I crouched down and studied them. The stride was long, and the prints ran parallel to my trail, then veered off uphill. I hadn't heard or seen anyone. No trucks, no smoke, nothing. I chalked it up to another hunter. Maybe someone else knew about the area, though I hadn't seen another vehicle since I left town. Still, I made note of it in my journal and moved on. That night, I kept the fire burning a little longer, just enough for light. On day 5, I woke up to something strange. My gear had been moved. Nothing was missing, but the order was different. My tarp had been unrolled halfway, and my water jug had been turned around, the cap loose. I know how I leave things. When you've been camping alone long enough, you notice the smallest changes. Someone had come through. I didn't hear them, didn't see them. That put a lump in my gut. I packed up some gear and went scouting, looking for tracks. Found them too. Same boots as the day before, now circling my camp in a wide loop, maybe 30 feet out. They stopped behind a boulder where they'd stood for a bit, heel dug deep like they were posted there for a while. Watching. I didn't like that. I didn't care if it was a hunter, a hiker, or just some weirdo. It's bad manners to sneak through a man's camp. I sat on a log with my rifle resting across my knees for most of that day. I didn't move far from camp. I didn't want to show fear, but I was alert now. Something wasn't sitting right. Day 6 was the worst. I left the camp just after sunrise to check the edge of the old logging trail, see if anyone had parked up there. Took me an hour to hike it. Still no tire tracks, no signs of a truck. When I got back, I froze at the tree line. My tent had been unzipped. The flap was wide open, my sleeping bag half pulled out. My bag of food was spilled, not torn up like an animal would do, opened. My journal was missing. I checked twice. It wasn't there. The fire pit had been disturbed. The rocks had been moved into a different shape, like someone had sat there and tried to build it again but didn't finish. My solar radio was gone. Just gone. No wind could have carried it off. I backed away and stayed hidden in the trees for a long while, rifle tight in my grip. I waited. An hour passed. Nothing moved. I circled the site from the outside and saw no new prints, just the same boot treads heading in and out. I packed everything I could into my rucksack. I was done. I wasn't staying another night. I didn't want to hike back to the truck in the dark, so I stayed hidden that day, deep in the brush, keeping low and quiet, my back against a tree. I didn't cook, didn't make a fire, just waited, finger resting on the safety of the rifle. That night, I didn't sleep, not even a minute. I heard footsteps around 3 a.m., slow, deliberate, crunch, pause, just outside the trees, maybe 20 feet off. Then silence. I didn't move. The footsteps didn't come closer. They just faded. After an hour of silence, I gathered my gear in the dark and started hiking. I didn't take the trail. I moved through thick brush, uphill, and around the normal path because I didn't want to risk being followed. Every snap of a twig made me jump. My flashlight was off most of the time. I used the stars and the memory of the terrain. Took me over 4 hours to reach the truck. When I saw it, parked just as I left it, I almost dropped to my knees. I didn't look back. I got in, turned the key, and drove down that mountain road with the windows open and rifle on the seat beside me. I made it home by early afternoon. The next day, I checked with the Forest Service. No one had permits to camp up there that week. No reports of hunters. The road I'd taken hadn't been cleared in months. They told me no one had called about lost gear, missing journals, or radios. I asked a friend who used to work with us, a guy named Travis, if Dale had ever mentioned anyone else using that site. He said no, just us. It's been over a year now. I never got that journal back. I still wonder who was up there. Someone knew that place. Someone had been watching me. Silent, careful, waiting for something. They didn't steal. They didn't attack. But they got close. Too close. I haven't gone camping alone since. But I still keep the rifle cleaned and ready, just in case. I was 28 when I decided to camp alone for the first time near a small graveyard in a quiet, forgotten part of West Virginia. It was early fall in 2016, and the air was cool and damp, with leaves already starting to fall in thick, crisp piles. I had been working in Charleston as a delivery driver for the past few years, and after a bad breakup and months of feeling drained, I wanted to just disappear into the woods for a couple of days. No phones, no people, just peace. I picked a remote spot about 2.5 hours south of the city, near an old back road that twisted through the Monongahela forest. I found the location through a blog post from some guy who wrote about forgotten graveyards in West Virginia. This one was small, with maybe 15 or 20 old gravestones, mostly sunken and unreadable. It was a half-mile off a dirt road, not fenced off, just sitting there in the woods, surrounded by oak and pine trees that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. It felt like the right place for what I needed. Quiet, remote, and a little strange. I loaded up my car with my usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, a cooler full of food and water, a small stove, extra batteries, a knife, and a heavy-duty flashlight. I even brought a folding shovel and tarp, just in case the weather turned or I needed to move some things around. My plan was to stay one night, maybe two, set up camp a few hundred feet from the graveyard, make a fire, cook a few simple meals, read, maybe hike around in the morning. I didn't expect anything more than that. I got there in the late afternoon. The sun was still high but starting to lean into that golden hour light. The dirt road had gone from rocky to nearly impassable near the end, and I parked just off the side, locking my car and tucking the keys into my backpack. From there, I followed a faint trail lined with moss-covered stones and tree roots that led straight to the graveyard. The whole area had an eerie stillness to it. Not creepy exactly, just very still. I didn't hear birds. No bugs. No wind. Just the crunch of my boots on the leaves. When I reached the graveyard, I stopped and looked around. It was barely more than a clearing, really. A few crooked headstones leaned toward the ground like they were trying to lie down. Some were cracked straight through. Others were so weathered I couldn't make out the names. The whole place was overgrown, with tall yellow grass and a few brambles creeping up between the stones. A thick, mossy smell hung in the air, and the ground felt soft under my boots. I decided not to pitch my tent directly in the graveyard. That seemed wrong somehow. Instead, I walked another 100 yards east and found a flat patch of ground just off a game trail, tucked between two tall trees. It was close enough to the graveyard that I could still see part of it through the trees if I stood in just the right spot. I set up camp slowly, making sure everything was tight and ready for the night. I cleared a fire ring, collected some fallen branches, and got a fire going as the sun dipped low. By the time darkness fell, I had cooked a small meal, some beans and sausage out of a can, and was sitting near the fire, sipping lukewarm coffee from my tin cup. The silence was deep, almost like being underwater. The woods didn't make a sound. I'd never experienced anything like that before. Even in the most remote parts of the forest, you usually hear something: crickets, owls, rustling leaves. But here, nothing. I told myself it was fine, just a quiet patch of land. No big deal. It was around 10 p.m. when I first heard something that didn't sit right. I was reading with my flashlight on low beam, the fire down to coals, when I caught a sound I hadn't heard before. Footsteps, very faint, like someone was walking slowly over leaves. I froze, listened. The sound stopped. I shut off my flashlight, just sat in the dark and waited. My ears were wide open. A minute passed, then two. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, something small. Then I heard it again, closer this time, still soft, still careful, but definitely not a small animal. It was deliberate. One step, then another, then a pause, like someone trying to be quiet. I stood up slowly and grabbed my flashlight. I clicked it on and aimed it in the direction of the sound, toward the graveyard. Nothing, just trees and darkness and my own breath. I waited another minute, my heart starting to pick up speed. Then, slowly, I walked toward the graveyard, keeping the beam low and tight. When I reached the edge of the trees, I stopped. There was no one there. The graveyard looked the same as before. Crooked stones, tangled grass, nothing moving. But the air felt different now, like it had thickened. There was a tension in the space that hadn't been there before. I stood there for a while, scanning with the light, feeling the cold start to bite at my face and hands. Eventually, I turned back toward camp. That's when I saw it. My tent had been moved. It was subtle, but I noticed it right away. I had set it facing west, with the zipper flap toward the trail. Now it was turned slightly, maybe 15 degrees off, like someone had grabbed the corner and dragged it just enough to shift it. And the flap was open. I ran to it. My heart was pounding now. I tore the flap open and shined my light inside. Nothing. Everything was still there, my sleeping bag, my pack, my gear. Nothing missing. But I knew I didn't leave it open like that. I always zip it closed. Always. Especially in the woods. Bugs, animals, there's no reason to ever leave it open. That's when I realized someone had been at my camp while I was near the graveyard. I backed away from the tent and started scanning the ground with my light. The leaves were thick, so it was hard to tell if there were footprints. But I thought I saw a few spots where the leaves had been disturbed. I wasn't sure. I stood there, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand, trying to figure out what to do. It was deep night now. No moon, no stars. Total black above the trees. The fire had nearly gone out. I didn't want to be there anymore, but the thought of walking back to my car through the woods in the dark, without knowing who or what was out there, seemed worse. So I made a decision. I packed everything, fast, folded the tent up roughly, stuffed it all into my pack, kicked dirt on the fire, and strapped the knife to my belt. I wasn't going to sleep out there. I was going to hike back to my car and leave. As soon as I stepped onto the trail, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they were behind me, not in front, not ahead, close. I whipped the flashlight around. Nothing. I started walking faster. The trail was hard to see in the dark, but I had marked a few trees earlier with strips of bright orange tape, and they helped guide me back. I moved fast, flashlight scanning every few feet, heart hammering. Then I heard it again. Closer, then a crack, like a stick snapping under weight. I didn't wait. I ran. Not an all-out sprint. I couldn't risk tripping, but a fast, desperate jog, my pack bouncing on my back, flashlight cutting wild arcs through the trees. The trail twisted, narrowed, then opened up again. I recognized the curve near the old stump and knew I was close, maybe 200 yards from the car. Then I saw it. A shape, just barely. On the trail behind me, someone was there. Not close enough for me to see their face or clothes, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Human, tall, still. I ran harder. I didn't look back again. I reached the car, unlocked it with trembling hands, threw my gear in the back, and got in. Locked the doors. I started the engine, floored it in reverse, then turned and sped down the dirt road, tires bumping over rocks and potholes. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement 30 minutes later. I drove straight home. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in my apartment with all the lights on, waiting for the sun. The next day, I filed a report with the local sheriff's office. They sent a deputy out to the area later that week. He called me afterward and said they didn't find anything unusual. No signs of camps, no footprints, no shelters. Nothing. But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there with me, watching me, moving my tent, following me through the woods. I don't camp alone anymore, and I never went back to that graveyard. I was 32 when I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. It was late September of 2018, and the trees in upstate Pennsylvania were already showing shades of orange and red. I'd taken time off from my job in Philadelphia and needed to get away from everything for a while. City noise, screens, people. I wanted quiet, open space, and cold, fresh air in my lungs. I picked a spot deep in the Allegheny National Forest. Not the usual campgrounds with lots of traffic and other campers, but a lesser-known stretch farther from the main roads. I found it on an old backpacking forum. A user had posted about a place near a fire road with thick tree cover, access to a stream, and no one around for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed everything into my Subaru Outback: tent, food, sleeping bag, clothes, stove, a cooler with ice, a small axe, lantern, and a lockbox for food because of the bears. I brought a Glock 19 I kept in a hard case in the trunk, just in case. I'd never had to use it before, and I hoped I wouldn't need to this time either. I drove up early on a Thursday morning. It was cold, in the low 40s when I left, and by the time I hit the forest roads, it was already misty. The trees loomed over the gravel road, wet leaves sticking to the windshield when I pulled off to get my bearings. There was no one out there. No cars, no hikers, no signs of anything. That excited me. I parked off a dead-end path and hiked in about 1.5 miles before I found a flat area tucked between thick pines. A small rise gave me a view of the woods below, and there was a narrow stream 20 or 30 yards off. I set up my tent, made a little ring of rocks for a fire, and laid out my gear. By mid-afternoon, I had a small fire going and a pot of chili heating up. I sat there for a while, spooning it slowly and watching the trees sway. The wind moved high above, but the ground felt still. I remember the quiet the most. No cars, no planes, no talking. Just the popping of the fire and the wind in the trees. I hiked a little before sunset to get a feel for the area. There was an old, overgrown trail near the stream that led farther into the woods. I followed it for maybe 15 minutes and turned around once it started getting darker. It was steep in some parts, and the fallen leaves made it slippery. That night, the temperature dropped into the 30s. I climbed into my bag and lay there for a long time just listening. I could hear branches snapping far off, probably animals. Small things, maybe a raccoon or deer. I wasn't worried. I've camped before. I know how to tell normal animal noises from something strange. But something started bothering me around 2 a.m. I woke up for no reason and had that feeling you get when you're being watched. The tent was zipped tight, and there was no light outside. No moon, no stars, just pitch black and quiet. Then I heard it, something heavy walking past the tent. Not running, just steady footsteps on the pine needles. Slow, crunch, pause, crunch, pause. I stayed completely still. My heart was beating hard. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I had the Glock in my car, locked up. Nothing inside the tent except a pocket knife, and even that was in my pack by the door. The steps stopped about 10 feet away, on the side of the tent where I had no windows. Nothing. I couldn't tell what it was. Could have been a bear, sure. But bears don't walk like that. It wasn't sniffing. It wasn't huffing or pacing. It sounded like a person. Eventually, the steps moved off. I lay awake until sunrise, clenching my fists under the sleeping bag, listening to every sound. In the morning, I got out of the tent and looked around. There were faint tracks near the edge of my camp. Not boots, not bare feet, just disturbances in the pine needles, like someone had walked in a soft shuffle. I brushed it off, told myself maybe it was a deer. Maybe it was a trick of the cold and wind. I didn't see any reason to pack up yet, so I stayed. The second day, I hiked deeper along the stream, following that same trail I'd found. The forest got thicker as I went. I saw an old hunting stand way up in a tree and snapped a photo with my phone. Moss-covered, abandoned, I turned back before noon and spent the afternoon cutting more firewood and boiling water from the stream. But I kept thinking about those footsteps. That night was quieter at first. I stayed up late by the fire, burning through half the woodpile, trying not to think too hard. Eventually, I crawled into the tent, checked the zipper 3 times, and pulled the sleeping bag tight. And again, sometime around 3 a.m., I heard it. Same steps, same slow pace, but this time they stopped closer, right outside the tent. Then a long pause, then a sharp, slow dragging sound, like something being scraped along the ground. It circled the tent once, then silence. I didn't sleep after that. The first light, I crawled out and looked again. There was a groove in the dirt, a single long line starting near the fire pit and dragging off toward the trees. I followed it about 20 feet before it faded into the leaves. I checked my gear. Nothing missing, nothing touched. That's when I decided I was done. I wasn't waiting around another night. I packed everything up quickly, threw everything in my backpack, collapsed the tent, didn't even bother to cook breakfast. I was sweating through my shirt even though it was freezing. As I started hiking back toward the car, I heard a branch snap. Not behind me, ahead of me, down the trail. I froze. Another snap closer. I couldn't see anyone. The trees were too thick. I stepped off the trail and crouched down behind a stump. I waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. My hands were shaking. I didn't hear anything else. I got up and moved fast, off trail now, pushing through thick brush, trying to cut across toward the fire road. I didn't want to go the same way I came. Something about the trail felt wrong. Like someone was watching it. Took longer. I got turned around once, but I finally found the road, maybe a quarter mile from where I parked. When I reached the car, I unlocked the trunk and grabbed the pistol case immediately. I loaded the Glock and kept it in my jacket pocket as I threw everything into the back. When I slammed the trunk, I saw it, a shape in the woods standing still half behind a tree about 30 yards off. Not moving. Watching me, I stared back, squinting. No details, just a figure, tall, thin, motionless. I got in the car and backed up fast, gravel popping under the tires. I turned around and didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. When I got home, I unpacked and found something that made my stomach turn. My sleeping bag had been unzipped all the way and zipped back up. I always zip it to my chest and tuck it under when I sleep. I don't unzip it at night. I don't leave it open. I had slept through someone reaching into my tent. I never went back to that forest. I didn't tell many people what happened. Who'd believe it? There were no ghosts, no monsters. Just something or someone out there who didn't want me there. Someone who came close enough to touch me while I was sleeping. I reported the location to a ranger station later that month. Just said I saw signs of people hiking off trail and strange behavior. They thanked me and told me they'd look into it. I doubt they did. To this day, I don't know who or what it was, but I learned something real and important. The woods are quiet for a reason, and sometimes you're not alone, even when everything tells you that you are. That's the last time I camped alone. It was a late October evening when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. I had been working long hours and felt like I just needed some time to clear my head. I was 27 at the time and living in the small town of Durango, Colorado, where the mountains were close enough to drive to but remote enough to get some peace. I chose a quiet camping spot I'd visited before, near a small creek that wound through a dense stretch of pine trees. The place was peaceful, tucked away from any hiking trails, and I figured I'd be alone. The drive to the campsite was uneventful, the road winding along the edge of the San Juan Mountains, the fall air cool enough to make my breath visible in the morning light. I hadn't seen anyone else on the road for miles, which was exactly how I liked it. I was on my own in the world, and I felt calm, even a little excited. I parked my truck near the site and unpacked my gear. A tent, sleeping bag, some cans of chili, a pack of trail mix, and my trusty camp stove. As I set up camp, the forest around me seemed to settle into a deep quiet. There was no sound of birds or wind rustling the trees, just a heavy stillness. At first, I thought it was odd, but I shrugged it off. I was used to being isolated in nature. It wasn't uncommon for wildlife to keep its distance. Once the sun began to set, the temperature dropped quickly. I lit a fire, feeling the warmth as I sat back, watching the flames flicker and dance. The night was crisp, but the fire kept me comfortable. The sky above was a blanket of stars, clearer than I'd ever seen in the city, and for a moment, I let myself relax. But then I heard something that broke the silence, the sound of footsteps. At first, I assumed it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then the sound came again. It wasn't the soft, irregular pad of paws on dirt. This was deliberate, steady, like someone walking toward me. I stood up, my heart racing for the first time all day, my senses alert. I strained my ears to catch the sound again, but it was gone. I figured it was my mind playing tricks on me, the stillness of the forest making every noise seem louder than it actually was. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer. The footfalls were heavier now, almost as if the person was coming straight at me. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack, my hand shaking slightly. I scanned the dark perimeter of my camp, but saw nothing but the towering pine trees stretching into the night. I listened closely, the silence hanging thick in the air before the footsteps stopped altogether. My heart was pounding now. I knew I wasn't alone, and it wasn't just the normal feeling of being watched. This was different. This was something purposeful, something that wanted me to know it was out there. I was about to call out, but I stopped myself. The last thing I wanted was to invite anyone or anything closer. Instead, I sat back down by the fire, trying to steady my breathing. I reasoned that it could be another camper, maybe someone who had gotten lost or was just out for a late-night walk. But then, just as I was beginning to relax again, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural sound. It wasn't quite a growl, but it wasn't far from it. I glanced over my shoulder toward the forest's edge, where the sound had come from, but the darkness was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet into it. I reached for my knife, a small pocket knife, but it made me feel a little better. As I held it tightly in my hand, I kept my eyes glued to the dark woods. The wind began to pick up, a cold breeze cutting through the air, sending the branches of the pines swaying slightly. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if whatever was out there could see me as clearly as I could see the fire in front of me. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. My mind was racing, wondering if I should pack up and leave or stay put and wait for whatever this was to pass. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but something about this wasn't normal. Suddenly, I heard it again, the footsteps, but they were different this time. They weren't coming straight at me. They were circling the perimeter of my campsite, moving quietly but deliberately. The way the steps shifted direction, it was as though whatever it was knew exactly where I was and was trying to approach from multiple angles. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear and shoved it into my backpack, not caring how rough I was with my things. I had to leave, but just as I started to move toward the truck, I froze. There, standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It was tall, too tall for a man. The shape of it was all wrong. Its posture was hunched, and it was covered in a coat of fur, almost like it was wearing a mask of animal skin. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, dark and wide, reflecting the firelight in a way that made them appear unnatural, almost glowing. For a split second, I thought it was a person in some kind of disguise, but I knew it wasn't. The creature was watching me, unmoving, but there was something about it that made every hair on my body stand up. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what it was, but I had a terrible, sinking feeling that I was dealing with something far beyond anything human. I turned and sprinted toward my truck, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My heart was thudding in my chest as I threw open the door and slammed it shut behind me. I didn't waste any time starting the engine and peeling out of the campsite. My hands were still trembling, and my eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature chasing me. But nothing appeared. The forest was still. The drive back to Durango felt like it took forever. I kept thinking I saw something in the corner of my vision. Shadows moving, figures standing just outside the reach of my headlights. But when I looked, there was nothing there. When I finally pulled into town, I parked in front of my small apartment and sat there, hands still shaking. I didn't know what had happened that night. I didn't know what that thing was in the forest, but I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't human. I never went back to that spot again. The memory of those eyes, the way they glowed in the darkness, has stayed with me. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't just an animal. It wasn't a man either. Maybe it was a skinwalker, or maybe it was something even worse. I don't care to find out. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and I'll never camp alone again. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo camping trip across parts of rural southern France. It was late September of 2017, and the air was already starting to change. The leaves were beginning to turn yellow and brittle, and the days were getting shorter, which meant fewer tourists and quieter woods. That's exactly what I wanted. Quiet. I had taken a sabbatical from my job back in Manchester. Burnout, mostly. The work never really ended, and everything in my life felt like it was on repeat. I figured some time away would help me get back in touch with things that mattered more. So I flew into Toulouse, rented a small car, and drove south toward the Eerie region, somewhere near a tiny place called Montpel. I'd picked the area because there were fewer people, lots of forest, and a lake I could set up camp near. There were no national parks or big trail signs. It was all unmanaged land, wide open and a little wild, which made it feel more personal. I brought everything with me: tent, cooking stove, enough dry food for 2 weeks, extra batteries, a foldable water filter, and a hunting knife I didn't think I'd actually use. I liked the idea of being away from people. No phones, no office emails, no one asking anything from me. The first couple of days were peaceful. I'd hike around the woods, fish a little near the lake, boil water for tea in the mornings, and sit by the fire when the evenings came. I kept a small journal where I'd write down what I saw or how I felt. I hadn't realized how loud the silence could be out in the woods. Every rustle, every bird call, every little splash in the water grabbed my attention. Felt raw, unfiltered. By the fourth night, I'd gotten into a rhythm. I picked a new campsite a little ways from the lake, maybe a mile east where the trees thinned near a river bend. I liked the sound of the water, especially at night. Felt alive but constant. That evening, I pitched the tent close to the river, cooked a simple meal of rice and lentils, and read from an old paperback book until it got too dark. Then I turned in early. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. The night was colder than I expected, and the tent walls were wet with condensation. I stepped outside barefoot, pulling on a hoodie and pointing my flashlight toward a spot behind a clump of trees. The woods were quiet, just the sound of water pushing over stones. I did what I needed to do, then stood for a minute and looked up at the stars. That's when I heard the crack. It wasn't close, but it was sharp, like someone stepping hard on a thick branch. I shut the light off and listened. A few more seconds passed. Nothing. Then another noise, slower, like leaves being brushed or moved through. I told myself it was probably a deer or a wild boar. They weren't uncommon here, especially near water. But I waited a bit longer just in case. I didn't hear it again, so I crawled back into the tent and zipped it up. The next morning, I walked around the area where I'd heard the sound. There were no real trails, just soft grass and a thin layer of dry leaves. I looked for prints but didn't see anything that stood out. I brushed it off and went on with the day. I kept moving over the next few days. I liked to pack up every couple of nights and find a new spot to pitch the tent. It gave me a sense of distance, like I was traveling even though I wasn't going very far. One afternoon, about a week in, I came across a narrow, overgrown path that split off from a dirt track I'd followed. It looked unused, like no one had walked it in a long time, but something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the curiosity of what might be at the end. The path twisted through the trees and narrowed even more until it opened slightly onto a small clearing that sat just above a wide part of the river. I could see the water curling around a bend, slow and thick, with tall grass and reeds growing along the bank. The place felt tucked away, hidden. I liked that. It felt like no one had been there in years. I decided that would be my next camp. That evening, I set everything up and got a fire going. I ate early, cleaned up, and then walked around the water's edge until it got too dark. I went to bed feeling calm. That didn't last long. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. It wasn't because of a noise or a dream. I just suddenly felt awake, alert, like my body had snapped into focus. The tent was cold, the kind of cold that makes your hands numb if you keep them out of the sleeping bag too long. I listened. Nothing. No water sounds. No wind. Just quiet. But not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet. I stayed still for a while, hoping I'd fall back asleep. But then I heard something again. Not an animal. It was softer than that. A slow drag like fabric brushing the ground. It stopped. Then a single step. Then another. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Whoever it was, they were moving just outside the tent. Not in a circle, not pacing, just stepping slowly, maybe 5 or 6 feet from where my head was. I kept my knife near the sleeping bag, and I slipped my hand toward it. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't call out. I didn't move a muscle. I just held my breath and waited. After what felt like forever, the steps stopped completely. I listened for more, but the silence held steady. Then, finally, I heard a distant snap, like a stick breaking farther into the woods. I waited another hour before I even moved. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the ground around the tent. There were impressions. Not boot prints, but something smaller. Barefoot maybe, or worn shoes. I couldn't tell exactly, but they were human. Not an animal. Not some lost dog. A person had stood outside my tent at night. I should have packed up and left. Looking back, I know that. But part of me didn't want to give up the trip because of one weird night. I told myself maybe it was some local out walking or a hunter who got lost. But I moved camp again that afternoon, heading farther down the river to a more open space where I could see more of my surroundings. It didn't help. That night, I kept a small fire going as long as I could. I stayed up, wrapped in a blanket, just staring into the dark. Around 2 in the morning, I saw her. She wasn't close at first, maybe 50 or 60 feet away across the river. She stood near the tree line, perfectly still. No light, no movement, just standing. I didn't know what I was looking at until my eyes adjusted more. She wore a long dark coat or dress, something that hung straight down to her ankles. Her hair was long, maybe dark, maybe gray. Hard to tell. But what I remember most is her stillness. Not like someone pausing, like someone frozen. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I stared at her and she stared right back. I could feel it, even from across the water. Minutes passed. Then, as slowly as anything I've ever seen, she turned and stepped backward into the trees. Gone. No sound.
No rustle.
Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I broke camp before the sun was even up. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just shoved everything into my pack and hiked fast, cutting east back toward the car. It was over 10 miles away, but I didn't care. I wanted out. As I hiked, I started noticing things. Small changes. Piles of rocks that hadn't been there before. Bundles of sticks tied together with bits of string. A piece of fabric hanging from a branch. Black, like part of a dress. I kept moving, heart racing, checking over my shoulder every couple of minutes. At one point, I thought I saw someone ahead of me on the path, just a flicker of movement. But when I reached the spot, no one was there. When I finally reached the car, I locked the doors and didn't start it for a long time. I sat there, breathing hard, thinking back on the trip, trying to make sense of it. But the one thing I couldn't get out of my head was how she looked. She wasn't angry. She didn't seem scared. She didn't even seem curious. She just watched. I drove back to Toulouse that afternoon and checked into a cheap hotel near the airport. I took a long shower, ate bad vending machine food, and didn't sleep much. I flew home the next day. I don't tell many people about that trip. When I do, I leave parts out. People don't want to believe something like that could happen. No one wants to think about a stranger watching them from the woods at night. But it happened. I later read that parts of southern France, especially rural areas, have long histories of squatters, wanderers, even isolated people who live off the grid. Not dangerous necessarily, but hidden. Maybe she was one of them. Maybe she thought I was trespassing. Or maybe she was just curious. I'll never know. What I do know is I've never gone back. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never that deep in the woods again. Some places, once you leave them, you don't return to. Not because of fear exactly, but because you know someone's still there, watching, and they remember you, just like you remember them. I was 32 when I went on a solo camping trip in the summer of 2019. At the time, I was living in Reno, Nevada, and I worked a construction job that left me mentally drained by the end of every week. My girlfriend had just left me 2 months earlier, and my head hadn't been right since. I needed to clear it. I'd done a bit of camping over the years, but this was the first time I was planning to go out completely alone for more than just a night. I had 3 full days off work, and I wanted to get as far from people as I could. I started planning the trip 2 weeks in advance. I didn't want to hit a popular site. Too many people, too many cars. So I looked into remote areas in Eastern California and stumbled across Grant Lake. It was near the June Lake Loop, not too far off Highway 158. I checked satellite maps and trail apps until I found an area about 5 miles from the lake itself. No established campgrounds, just woods and a long ravine that ran south along a narrow dirt road. According to the maps, that road was barely used and didn't connect to anything major. That's what I wanted. I packed enough to last 4 days just in case. I brought my backpacking tent, my Jetboil stove, a small pot, dehydrated meals, a first aid kit, bear spray, a few extra knives, my .38 revolver, a water filter, and my usual camping gear. I also packed a compact shovel and brought a foldable saw in case I needed firewood. I didn't plan on lighting any fires since it was dry out and I didn't want to risk it, but I brought the saw anyway. You never know. I left early on a Thursday morning. The drive took about 4 hours, mostly because the last 30 minutes were all on dirt roads. I passed Grant Lake, followed the main road for a few more miles, then turned off onto an even narrower trail that curved uphill, then back down through tall, dry pines and patches of exposed granite. I didn't see another car after leaving the highway. When I finally parked, I was about half a mile from where the trail dead-ended near the top of the ravine. The sun was still high. I slung on my pack and hiked until I found a spot near the edge of the slope, where the trees broke open just enough for me to see out across the valley. It was perfect, quiet, no signs of anyone, and just far enough from the road that I couldn't hear a thing but wind and birds. I set up my tent under a thick pine and cooked my first meal while watching the sun drop behind the mountains. That night, I slept surprisingly well. No weird sounds, no animals sniffing around, nothing to wake me up. I'd expected my nerves to keep me from getting any real sleep, but the silence was the best thing I'd felt in weeks. The next day, I explored the area more. I followed the edge of the ravine south for maybe a mile, taking note of landmarks like odd tree shapes and big boulders in case I needed to find my way back without GPS. I found an old deer trail that cut through some dense brush and led down into the bottom of the ravine. It was steep, but I made it down without falling. At the bottom, I found a narrow creek running along the rocks, mostly dry, but with a few deep pools of clear water. There were raccoon prints and deer tracks along the edges, but I didn't see anything bigger. I filtered some water from the cleanest pool and sat for a while just listening. It was quiet, but not dead quiet. I could still hear birds and the occasional buzzing fly, but something about the way the sound bounced in the ravine made me feel like I wasn't alone. I kept telling myself it was just how isolated the place was. It was probably messing with my senses, but the feeling stuck in my gut, like someone was watching. I brushed it off and climbed back up to camp. That night was different. Just after sunset, I heard something move outside my tent. It was a slow step, not fast or frantic like a squirrel or a raccoon, just one heavy step. I grabbed my flashlight and listened, heart racing. Another step, closer this time. I reached for my revolver and unzipped the tent just an inch. I shined the light out, sweeping the area. Nothing, just trees. I didn't see anything moving. I waited there for maybe 10 minutes, barely breathing. The sound didn't come again. After a while, I zipped the tent up and laid back down, gun by my side. Maybe it was just a deer passing through. Maybe it heard me move and took off. I don't know, but I didn't sleep well that night. In the morning, I stepped outside and walked the perimeter of my camp. I looked for tracks or disturbed pine needles, anything. I found nothing unusual. No deep footprints, no animal droppings. Just my own boot tracks and a few spots where squirrels had dug around. I was starting to feel paranoid. I told myself it was just nerves again. I spent that third day hiking further up the ravine. I wanted to burn off the uneasiness. I took my day pack, left the tent behind, and followed the ridgeline west. I didn't plan to go far, but the terrain kept pulling me deeper. I found an old campsite at one point, just a ring of stones where someone had built a fire years ago. I didn't see any trash or gear. It looked abandoned, like no one had used it in a long time. Past that, I found what looked like a collapsed structure. Just a few beams of wood rotting in the dirt and some old rusted nails. Maybe an old ranger post or hunter's shack. I took a few photos and moved on, feeling more unsettled now. That feeling of being watched had returned, and it was stronger. It wasn't just a gut feeling anymore. It felt like I was being followed. I started heading back, taking a faster pace than I'd used on the way out. I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woods felt off, not in a supernatural way, just wrong, like something was moving just out of sight. The hair on my neck was up. I unholstered my revolver as I walked. When I got back to my camp, it was nearly dark, and something was wrong. My tent was shifted, rotated maybe a foot to the side. One of the corner stakes was loose, and the flap was halfway open. I'd zipped it shut before I left. I was sure of it. I circled the tent, gun in hand. Nothing around. No tracks. No sound. I backed off and sat on a rock 20 feet away, just watching it. If someone was still nearby, I didn't want to get ambushed. I waited until full dark, then finally walked over and checked inside. Nothing was missing. My gear was still there, my pack untouched, but I noticed something odd. One of my knives, my backup fixed blade, was moved. It was no longer in the side pouch of my bag. It was on top of my sleeping bag. I hadn't put it there. No way I would have done that. Someone had gone through my stuff. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat outside the tent with my back to the tree, revolver in my lap. Every small sound made me twitch. Twice I thought I saw movement between the trees, but I couldn't confirm it. Whatever or whoever was out there wasn't stupid. They were staying out of the flashlight's reach. By dawn, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed everything fast, shoving gear into my bag and taking down the tent with shaking hands. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to get out. I hiked fast, heart pounding the whole time. I felt like I was being hunted. About a mile from where my car was parked, I found something that confirmed it. Hanging from a low branch was a strip of red cloth, tied in a knot. I hadn't put it there. I didn't even have red cloth. It looked like part of a shirt or a flag. Beneath it, wedged between two rocks, was an empty can of chili. It was clean, washed out. Not mine. Someone had camped there recently. Someone had been watching. I moved faster, barely caring about twisting an ankle. When I finally reached my car, I almost dropped my keys trying to unlock the door. I didn't stop until I hit the highway again. I drove all the way back to Reno in one shot. When I got home, I unloaded my gear and double-checked everything. That knife that had been moved, I packed it last. It still had a faint smudge on the handle, a greasy fingerprint that didn't look like mine. I never called the police. I didn't even tell my friends. What could I say? Someone was messing with me in the woods? There was no proof, but I know what happened. Someone was out there, maybe living off-grid, maybe just passing through. But they found my camp, went through my stuff, and stayed just close enough to keep from being seen. And they were smart about it. They didn't steal anything. They didn't leave trash. They just moved things, left signs, watched. I haven't been camping alone since, and I won't again. Not out there, not anywhere. I was 32 when I decided to camp alone in Iowa. I lived in Fort Dodge at the time, working part-time at a local hardware store. The days were always the same. Clocking in, helping customers find bolts and hinges, restocking shelves, and eating lunch in the break room next to the cleaning supplies. My life had no real movement, no direction. I felt like I was stuck in a loop. So I started hiking more, camping on weekends, trying to feel like I was doing something different, something that felt like living. I had camped alone a few times before, usually in places like Ledges State Park or Brushy Creek. This time, I wanted to try somewhere a little more isolated, not deep wilderness, just somewhere off the beaten trail, where I wouldn't hear trucks on the highway or see families with coolers and folding chairs. I found a spot on an old map that looked promising. It was part of a public hunting area about 45 minutes from town. No designated campsites, just a parking lot and some old trails that cut through thick woods and low, marshy ground. I packed light, one-person tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, lighter, a small camp stove, and just enough food and water for 2 days. It was supposed to be a short trip, arrive in the afternoon, hike in a few miles, set up camp, spend the night, hike out in the morning. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going. That was probably my first mistake. The day I went out, the weather was dry but gray. The forecast mentioned a chance of showers later that night, maybe some thunderstorms, but I figured it would pass. I've camped through rain before. It wasn't ideal, but it never really bothered me. I liked hearing the rain on the tent. I liked the way it made the woods feel different, quieter, more private. The gravel parking lot was empty when I arrived. That made me feel better, to be honest. I wasn't looking to run into anyone out there. I signed the logbook at the trailhead, even though I didn't think anyone ever checked it. Then I pulled my pack on and started walking. The trail was rough and narrow, overgrown in spots, and marked only by the occasional faded blaze on a tree. I followed it for about 2 hours, veering off when I found a small clearing near a creek. It was perfect, flat, dry, and surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides. You couldn't see the trail from the clearing, and you couldn't hear anything but birds and water moving over rocks. I set up my tent beneath a stand of tall cottonwoods. Their branches hung low, and the ground underneath was soft with fallen leaves. I got a small fire going with some dry sticks and made a quick meal on my stove, just noodles and canned beef. It wasn't much, but it filled me up. By the time the sun dropped behind the trees, the sky was already turning dark gray. I walked down to the creek with my flashlight and filled a water bottle using a filter to clean it. Then I sat by the fire and listened.
No voices, no engines.
Just wind and the occasional crack of a branch shifting somewhere in the woods. Around 9 p.m., the rain started. It came in slow, light at first, just enough to sizzle on the coals and send me into the tent. I zipped it up tight, pulled my sleeping bag over my legs, and turned off the light. I lay there listening to the rain grow stronger, hitting the nylon like thousands of tiny fingers drumming in no real pattern. That was the last part of the night that felt peaceful. About an hour later, maybe more, I heard something that made me sit up. Not thunder, not wind, something else, something closer. It sounded like footsteps, not walking directly toward me, not that clear, but moving around. Stepping through wet brush, slow, careful, but not the kind of careful an animal makes. The steps were spaced apart. I could tell from the sound. It wasn't the skittering of a raccoon or the soft patter of a deer. I held my breath and listened harder. The rain muffled everything, but I knew what I heard. At first, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. My brain was probably playing tricks on me, mixing the sound of rain and wind and imagination into something human. But the steps kept happening. Closer, then further, then closer again, like someone walking in a loose circle around my tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I sat frozen in the dark, hand wrapped around my flashlight, too afraid to turn it on. Then I heard it, quick and sharp. A cough, a real human cough. Close. My stomach dropped. I didn't say anything. I didn't yell or unzip the tent. I didn't move. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing. The cough didn't come again, but the footsteps shifted. They moved to the side of the tent where I kept my backpack. Then they stopped. I waited, still no sound. Then the zipper on the tent door twitched. Not opened, just twitched, like someone had touched it lightly, testing it. Couldn't take it. I turned the flashlight on and pointed it at the door. Nothing. I couldn't see through the fabric, just shadows. I didn't hear running. No movement, just rain again. I held the light on for at least 10 minutes before I turned it off. The seconds felt like hours. My mind was racing. I thought about unzipping the tent and looking, but every part of me said that was a bad idea. Eventually, I lay back down, fully dressed, with the flashlight in one hand and my pocket knife in the other. I knew I wouldn't sleep. I just had to make it until morning. But the night didn't end there. Around 2 a.m., the rain let up. I could hear better now, and I wished I couldn't. There was something out there. Not walking this time, digging. The sound came from the direction of the creek. Slow, rhythmic scraping, like a small shovel or something metal being dragged through dirt. It wasn't an animal. No animal makes that sound. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. The sound was too real, too specific. I stayed in the tent until the sky started to turn gray. It was still raining, just barely, and the woods were quiet again. I opened the tent slowly, every part of me tense, waiting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. I stepped outside. The fire was cold, and the ground was soaked. My backpack was where I left it, but the side pocket had been unzipped. Inside, my knife was gone. I felt a chill run down my back. I looked around, trying to spot footprints, but the rain had covered everything. The clearing looked normal, but I knew it wasn't. I walked toward the creek. About 50 yards from my tent, just past a mossy log, I found it. A hole, roughly the size of a suitcase, dug into the soft ground, about a foot deep, full of muddy water. There were boot prints around it, fresh, deep ones. Someone had been digging in the rain, in the dark, just a few hours ago, and not with their hands. I saw marks in the mud that looked like the edge of a small shovel or trowel. I didn't wait to see more. I went back, tore down my tent as fast as I could, and stuffed everything into my bag. I didn't care how wet it was. I just needed to leave. I took the trail back at a near run. The woods felt different now, hostile, watching. Every tree seemed closer, every sound sharper. My legs were burning, my chest tight, but I didn't stop. When I made it to the parking lot, my car was still there. Nothing had been touched. I threw my gear in the back and got inside, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a while, hands shaking, staring at the trailhead. The logbook was still open, its pages soaked with rain. I hadn't seen anyone else. No cars.
No campers.
No reason someone would have been out there that night. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone walked around my tent and coughed? That they dug a hole near a creek? It wouldn't mean anything to anyone else. But it meant something to me. That hole wasn't random. It was in a spot where someone could see my tent through the trees. Someone had been watching me. Maybe they thought I had something in my pack. Maybe they just wanted to scare me. Or maybe it was worse than that. The knife was never recovered. I replaced it, but it never felt the same. I never went back to that trail. Never camped alone again. Not even in safe places. Not even close to home. I still camp sometimes with friends or in campgrounds with other people around. But something changed in me that night. The woods don't feel peaceful anymore. They feel hollow, like something's always waiting just out of view. That night didn't end in a scream or a chase. It ended with me driving away soaked and scared. But that was enough. That was the moment I realized the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're people, real people, out in the middle of nowhere, doing things you'll never understand. And that hole in the ground? I think about it a lot, about how it wasn't finished, about how it looked like the start of something, not the end. Sometimes I wonder if it was meant for me. I never told anyone about what happened that week in August 2016. I was 32, working warehouse shifts in a small town called Telford, out in Shropshire. I had just quit drinking that summer, and I thought I was finally getting my head on straight. Most of my mates were either married off or glued to the pub every weekend, and I didn't want to sit around in my flat feeling tempted. So I started walking more, exploring the outskirts of town, just trying to clear my mind. That's how I ended up making the dumb decision to camp in a graveyard. There's a trail north of Telford that leads past some overgrown fields and an old sheep farm. Past that, you hit the treeline and follow it for about 2 miles before it breaks open to a ridge with this forgotten cemetery. No signs, no markers, no real fencing. Just this little rectangle of land tucked into a slope with a few headstones barely standing upright. I passed it once while walking in late July. The place was quiet, hidden. I thought it might be perfect for a little solo camping trip, something to get away from everything and think properly. I wanted quiet, and that graveyard seemed to promise it. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, knife, torch, water, oats, some protein bars, and a wind-up radio I kept for company. I left around noon on a Tuesday so I'd get there well before dark. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I figured it would just be a one-night trip. I didn't even think twice about setting up camp in a graveyard. It was abandoned, and most of the stones were so weathered you couldn't even read the names anymore. The last date I saw was from 1897. When I reached the ridge, the sun was already dipping behind the clouds. The trees behind the cemetery cast long shadows, but the view in front of it, rolling hills, a patch of dead corn, and some open grazing land was beautiful. I set up my tent at the edge, about 20 feet from the nearest headstone. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful or anything. I just wanted a quiet place where no one would bother me. As the light faded, the air got noticeably colder. Even though it had been warm earlier, the graveyard sucked up the heat like a sponge. I zipped up my jacket and sat on a flat rock while I ate. There wasn't much sound, just the wind shifting through the trees behind me. I had a strange feeling in my chest. Not fear, but something heavier, like the silence was pressing down on me. The kind of quiet that gets into your ears and makes your heartbeat sound loud. I tried not to think about where I was. I'd seen cemeteries before. I wasn't superstitious. These were just old bones buried in the ground. There were no lights, no roads nearby, and no houses in sight. That's what I'd wanted, just nature and silence. I lay in the tent around 9 p.m. and listened to the radio a bit. Static mostly. Then I heard an old football recap, which helped me settle down. I fell asleep quicker than I expected, but I woke up again around midnight, freezing. My sleeping bag was zipped, and I had 2 layers on, but the cold was sharp. It felt damp, like something in the ground was rising through the fabric of the tent. I unzipped the flap and looked outside. It was dark, thick dark, with a sky full of cloud cover. I couldn't see the stars. My torch beam only reached about 10 feet before the light got swallowed up. I didn't hear anything at first, just the same wind pushing lightly through the trees. But then I noticed something that still makes my skin go tight. The field just beyond the graveyard ridge, where the land dipped down into a dry patch of grass, had a figure in it. Person. They were crouched low to the ground, almost like they were squatting. No movement, just squatting, staring toward the graveyard. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or a fox, but this shape was too still, too human. My eyes adjusted a little. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, and he wasn't just squatting. He was watching. I backed into the tent slowly and zipped it without making a sound. I killed the torch. My heart was thudding in my ears. I waited. I didn't breathe too hard, just listened. After maybe 10 minutes, I peeked again. Gone. The field was empty. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the knife close, tucked in the bag with my hand around the handle. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just a farmer. Maybe someone else found this place and had the same idea as me. But who just squats in a field at midnight watching a stranger's tent in an abandoned cemetery? By sunrise, my eyes were heavy, but I still hadn't slept. I packed up everything, ready to leave, but something in me said to stay. I told myself it could have been in my head. I've been stressed lately. No sleep, lots on my mind. Maybe I imagined it. So I stayed another night. I should have left when I had the chance. The second day was quiet. I walked around the area more, followed the ridge east, and found an old dry streambed that led to a rusted gate. It looked like a private farm path, overgrown and unused. There were no tracks, no recent prints. Still, I got a strange feeling the whole walk, like something was off. I'd grown up in the countryside. I knew what a quiet field sounded like. This felt different, like the ground was holding its breath. I made it back by late afternoon. The air felt heavier than before. That cold never left the graveyard area, even with the sun out. I sat against a tree and tried to write in my notebook, but I kept checking over my shoulder. As it got dark, I set up my tent closer to the trees this time. I thought maybe I'd feel safer backed into the woods rather than exposed on the ridge. I ate early and climbed into the sleeping bag before full dark. At around 11 p.m., I heard the sound again. Not footsteps, not wind. Digging. I froze. I knew that sound, dull and dry, like something being scraped out of soil with a metal edge. Not fast, but steady. I unzipped the tent slowly and crouched outside, trying to keep low. The moon was faint behind clouds, but I could see well enough. There was someone at one of the graves, near the middle of the cemetery, maybe 20 feet from the nearest stone. They were kneeling, back hunched, digging with what looked like a short shovel or even their hands. There was a small pile of dirt already. I don't know how long I crouched there watching. It didn't feel real. Who digs up a grave at night, in the middle of nowhere? I crept backwards into the trees and sat behind a thick trunk. I didn't want to run and make noise. I waited. After a while, the digging stopped. I didn't hear footsteps, just silence. I stayed hidden until morning. When I finally came out, I walked toward the grave they'd been digging. I expected to see a hole, but there was nothing, just dead grass, no fresh dirt, no sign anything had been moved. I walked the cemetery 3 times, still nothing. I packed my things and left right then. I told myself I'd never go back. I made it halfway down the trail before stopping to eat. My hands were shaking. I kept looking behind me. I wasn't even hungry, just needed something to do with my hands. I sat on a log and looked up the ridge one more time. There was something at the edge of the cemetery. A mirror, just a small square one, leaning up against a headstone. It hadn't been there before. I didn't go back up. When I got home, I didn't unpack. I took the knife and buried it in a drawer. That trip felt like something had followed me back. The nights after that, I kept waking up sweating. I checked the windows. I kept the lights on. Every time I walked home from work, I felt like someone was a step behind. A week later, I went back. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself it was all in my head. Maybe I needed closure. I took my car as far as the edge of the woods and walked up the trail. The cemetery was different. Someone had been clearing it. The weeds were flattened. The headstones were cleaned. A small path had been cut through the middle, and the grass looked like it had been trimmed. There were fresh tracks, boots, a shovel left leaning on the fence. I didn't stay long. I walked the whole perimeter once and then left. A few days after that, I saw a story in a local Facebook group. A missing man's body had been found in a shallow grave near Telford, not far from a dry stream bed past a ridge. He'd been reported missing months earlier. They weren't sure who buried him.
No suspects.
No signs of a struggle, but the grave was new. I never told the police what I saw. I've thought about it almost every day since. I don't think I saw the killer. I think I saw someone else finding the body and digging it up. Maybe someone trying to hide it better. Or maybe someone who had nothing to do with it but had their own reasons to bury it again. All I know is this: whoever was crouching in that field, whoever was digging in the dark, they weren't surprised by me. They knew I was there. That mirror wasn't left by accident. That place wasn't just a forgotten graveyard. It was being used. Still is. And I think the only reason I made it out is because I left when I did. I haven't been back, and I never will. It was late September 2016 when I took time off from work to spend a few days in the countryside with my wife, Hannah. I was 33 then, and she had just turned 31. We'd been married 5 years and had done a fair bit of camping together over the years, but this trip was the first time we were heading to a spot neither of us had been before. Somewhere a little off-grid in Cumbria, just outside Grasmere. I'd found the place after digging through a forum on wild camping in the UK. A man had mentioned an old forest clearing about 2 miles west of Grasmere village. According to his post, it was rarely visited because it wasn't marked on any proper trail. He said the trees opened up in a wide circle, hidden behind a low ridge, and the nearest building was an abandoned sheepfold nearly a mile away. It sounded perfect for what we wanted. Quiet, isolation, and space to set up camp in peace. We drove up from Sheffield on a Friday morning. I had the back of the car packed with our tent, gear, supplies for 3 days, and a small cooler of food. The forecast said light showers were possible, but nothing serious. The plan was to hike in during daylight, pitch the tent in the clearing, and spend the weekend mostly relaxing, reading, cooking on the little gas stove, maybe hiking out a bit if the weather stayed dry. We parked the car at a gravel turnout near an old stone wall that bordered a sheep field. From there, we walked along a rough animal trail, following a line of pine and ash trees. It took about 40 minutes of uneven walking, the last part uphill, before we found the clearing. It was exactly like the forum post had described. A wide, circular opening surrounded on all sides by tall, dark pines. The ground inside was flat, soft with moss, and covered in thick pine needles. There were no paths leading in or out, just the break in the trees we came through. You couldn't see the clearing from outside unless you were nearly inside of it. That made it feel more hidden than I expected. We set up the tent near the western edge, where a large boulder sat like a natural windbreak. I cleared some pine cones and old twigs while Hannah laid out the ground sheet. The air had a damp, earthy smell, not unpleasant, just the scent of a deep forest with a storm somewhere far off. We spent the afternoon boiling water for tea, drying our socks in the sun while it lasted, and walking small loops around the clearing. There wasn't much wildlife. Some crows overhead, a couple of deer tracks, and the occasional rustle of something small in the undergrowth. Around 6, the clouds thickened. By then, we'd eaten and zipped up the tent for the night. We lay in our sleeping bags reading under headlamps, and I remember the soft patter of rain starting just as I was nodding off. It was the kind of rain that doesn't seem like it's falling so much as drifting light, but persistent. Not heavy enough to be loud, just a faint tapping on the fabric above us. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. It wasn't from the rain. It was something else. I couldn't tell what at first. Just a feeling. That kind of uncomfortable awareness when you're half asleep and realize you're listening for something. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, and felt the chill of the air inside the tent. It wasn't cold, just cool enough to notice it had dropped since we fell asleep. The rain had stopped, but I could hear something outside, very faint, not constant. It sounded like movement. I waited, trying not to breathe too loud. I glanced at Hannah beside me. She was turned away, bundled in her bag, breathing slow, still asleep. The sound outside came again. At first I thought it might be a deer. There are red deer in Cumbria, and the woods are full of small ones. But this didn't sound like hooves. It was softer, heavier, not 4 legs. It sounded like steps, but not approaching the tent. They were distant, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, and slow. Not a walk. 1 step, pause, then another. It wasn't circling us, just moving. I kept listening, straining my ears, and I realized it was on the other side of the clearing, somewhere past the trees. There was no light outside.
No moon.
Just dark forest and the faint dripping of rain from the pine branches. I unzipped the sleeping bag and slowly sat up. My boots were at the end of the tent. I reached for them but didn't put them on. Just listened. The footsteps stopped. I sat still for several minutes. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, but I didn't move. Then I heard something again, different this time. A scraping sound. Not metal. Wood on wood? Or maybe bark. Something being dragged slowly. I leaned forward and unzipped the tent just an inch.
No flashlight.
Just that little flap. There was no visibility. Nothing. I closed the flap again. Sat there, frozen. Then another sound, low, sharp, like a breath. Not an animal growl. Just a sharp exhale, short and close. I felt this wave of panic rise in my chest. Not terror, not yet. Just the realization that someone or something was out there, standing in the woods around our camp. and we were alone. I didn't wake Hannah. I don't know why. Maybe part of me still thought I was overreacting. Maybe it was a hunter or a hiker who got turned around. I lay back down but kept my boots in my hands. The rest of the night, I barely slept. When dawn broke, gray and wet, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The moss was slick underfoot, and mist clung low to the ground. I walked around the clearing slowly, checking the ground. There were marks, nothing clear, but something had pressed into the moss in a few places. Not boot prints, not deer, just compressed spots, maybe an inch deep, the shape hard to make out. I looked out past the trees where I'd heard the sounds. I saw nothing. I didn't say anything to Hannah that morning. I just said I hadn't slept well. We made tea, ate a cold breakfast, and spent the morning doing nothing much. By early afternoon, the sky had darkened again. The forecast hadn't mentioned anything serious, but around 3, the rain started heavy. We zipped up the tent and settled in. By 7, the tent was soaked. Not leaking, but damp all over. We made a quick dinner with the gas stove and tried to stay positive, even laughing at how our plan for a peaceful weekend was going. Then the thunder started. Low, rolling, far away. Hannah was getting drowsy around 9, so she lay back, and I stayed sitting, watching the tent walls shiver with wind and listening to the rain hammering the tarp. And then I heard it again. This time it was close. That same slow step. One, then another.
No rhythm.
Just waiting, then moving again. It was outside the clearing. I didn't move. I just sat there, completely still, staring at the tent wall. The wind covered most other noises, but I could hear it when the gusts paused. A step, crunch, wait, another. It was coming closer. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My hands were cold, and my mouth was dry. I didn't unzip the tent this time. I just waited. The steps stopped. The rain got louder again, washing over everything. For 10 minutes, maybe more, there was nothing. Then a snap, a branch, close. I wanted to wake Hannah, but I still didn't. I kept waiting for it to go away. Then came the scrape, same as the night before, dragging wood across bark or rock. It was right outside. I didn't breathe. I sat there, heart beating so hard it hurt. Then something brushed against the side of the tent. Just the faintest push, like a hand. It didn't press in, just grazed the fabric. I flinched but didn't make a sound. Then nothing. Absolute silence for the next hour. Eventually, I lay back, fully clothed, eyes wide open. Hannah stirred once, but I didn't say anything. I just listened. By morning, the rain had stopped again. We packed quickly. Neither of us spoke much. I told her I thought we should head back early. She didn't ask why. Maybe she felt it too. On the way out, I checked the trees near our tent. There were marks, fresh ones. Long, deep scratches in the bark about 5 feet high. Not claw marks, not animal. Looked like they were made with a knife. 5 straight lines. We left. When we got back to the car, the tires were fine, the windows untouched, but the back bumper had 2 dents. Not from a crash, no paint, no scrape. Just 2 perfect, shallow inward punches in the metal, like someone had hit it with something hard. I never reported it, never posted about it. I never even went back to the forum. We still go camping sometimes, but never off-grid, never in hidden places. That night in the clearing, whatever it was, I still don't have an answer for it. But I know it was real, and I know we were being watched. And if we hadn't left that next morning, I don't think we'd have walked out. I was 32 when it happened. I'd been working construction in Reno for about a year and had started to feel boxed in by the city. Too many cars, too much noise, not enough space to breathe. I grew up in Idaho where you could walk for hours in the woods and not see another soul, so I guess I was just used to that. Every now and then, I needed to get out and remind myself that kind of silence still existed somewhere. It was late October 2016. I had the weekend off and didn't want to spend it in my apartment, so I packed up my gear and drove out toward the Nevada desert. I didn't have a set destination, just a vague plan to find a spot off the beaten path and set up camp. I liked it that way, no campgrounds, no fire rings, no signs, just raw land, some peace, and maybe a cold beer under the stars. Around 3 hours southeast of Reno, I turned off onto a long dirt road that twisted through some low desert hills. It was BLM land, no private signs, no gates, just open country. I remember seeing an old rusted sign that said something like Silver Pine Mining Company, with an arrow pointing toward the hills. I figured it was one of those dozens of abandoned mines scattered through the Nevada backcountry. I wasn't really interested in the mine, just the remoteness of the area. The road climbed steadily and got rougher. After about 10 miles of crawling along at maybe 10 miles per hour, I found a flat patch of dirt near some scattered Joshua trees and set up my tent. There was a dry creek bed a little ways down the hill and a view of some rocky cliffs to the east. It looked like nobody had been out there in years. The only sounds were the dry wind moving through the brush and the occasional bird. I walked around a bit before dark, cracked a beer, and sat by my little propane stove while I cooked some sausages. I felt good. It was the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones. But when the sun dropped behind the hills and the cold came in fast, I started to feel watched. It wasn't anything I could explain, just that weird sense that something's off. At first, I thought maybe a coyote or mountain lion was in the area. I'd seen fresh tracks earlier, not human ones, just some prints I couldn't quite identify in the hard dirt. They weren't fresh enough to worry me, but still. I scanned the ridgelines as I ate. The desert at night plays tricks on you. You'll think you see shapes out there, but it's just rocks, shadows, the way your headlamp catches dust in the air. I told myself that and zipped up my tent when I went to sleep. I left my boots outside like I always do and kept my knife beside me inside the tent. I woke up at around 3 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. Not an animal, not wind. It was a sharp clack, like a rock tapping against another rock. It wasn't close, maybe 100 feet out, but it came again. Then again. 3 sharp taps. Then silence. I sat up and unzipped the tent a few inches. The moon was bright and lit up the desert like a dim parking lot. I couldn't see anything moving. I thought maybe a rock slide, but it didn't sound natural. It sounded deliberate. After about 15 minutes, I went back to sleep, though I didn't sleep deeply. I woke up again at dawn. The light was gold and quiet and peaceful, but when I stepped out of the tent to put on my boots, I froze. My boots were gone. I searched all around the tent thinking maybe I'd kicked them off or an animal dragged them a few feet. Nothing. Not a trace. Just my socks, cold and covered in sand. I looked for tracks but couldn't find anything clear. The ground was packed hard. I felt uneasy but tried to think logically. Maybe I'd set them further away than I thought. Maybe I'd sleepwalked, but I've never done that in my life. I spent the morning barefoot, walking in slow circles around my site. I didn't see anyone. No vehicles, no trash, nothing human. That mine, the one the old sign pointed toward, was maybe a half-mile hike east. I figured I might as well check it out. My feet were raw, so I cut up an old shirt and tied pieces around them for makeshift soles, then walked toward the cliffs. The trail was barely visible, just a faint indentation in the earth where the old road had been. When I got to the mine entrance, I saw the fence had long since fallen. The boards were sun-bleached and cracked. The entrance was a black hole in the side of the hill, wide enough to drive a truck into. There were broken timbers and rusted-out mining gear scattered around. A twisted metal cart, piles of rocks, a busted winch. I didn't go inside. I'm not an idiot. Old mines are death traps. The air inside them can kill you or the whole shaft can collapse. But I walked around the edge and found something that didn't sit right.
Bootprints.
They were fresher than anything else around, maybe a day or two old. Deep tread, probably from heavy work boots. But there was only one set. Not a trail, just a few prints near the mouth of the mine pointing inward. There were no tire marks, no other footprints, nothing showing where the person had come from or gone. Just that single pair of boot prints that stopped at the edge of the mine. And the size was wrong. They weren't normal. They were long, like someone with clown feet, but the width didn't match the length. They were narrow, almost dainty in the heel, like someone was wearing boots several sizes too big. I felt my skin crawl. Something was off about this place. I hurried back to my site, packed up everything I could carry in one trip, and started walking back down the road barefoot. My plan was to come back later for the rest of my gear once I found a signal or someone to help. I walked for about an hour before I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. It was faint, but definitely a motor, maybe a truck or ATV. I stopped and listened. It echoed off the hills and was impossible to pinpoint, but it didn't sound like it was getting closer, just circling. I hid behind a bush and waited. The sound faded after a while. I didn't see any dust trails or movement, but I stayed hidden for another hour just to be sure. Eventually, I got up and kept walking. When I finally got back to my truck, I nearly screamed. Someone had broken in. The driver's side door was cracked open, and the glove box had been rifled through. Nothing was stolen, just moved around like whoever had done it wasn't looking for valuables, just something specific. My boots were in the back seat. Not thrown, not dumped, placed perfectly upright, with the laces tucked in and the soles clean, like they'd never touched dirt. That night, I didn't go home. I drove into Fallon and got a room at a motel. I locked the door, pulled the curtains, and didn't sleep. I stared at those boots, trying to make sense of it. The next morning, I drove back out to get the rest of my gear. It was gone. The tent, the stove, my backpack, everything. All of it gone without a trace.
No trash, no ashes, no footprints.
The dirt was smooth, like someone had swept the whole area. I contacted the sheriff's office in Fallon and filed a report. The deputy looked bored, said squatters or desert drifters sometimes passed through those parts, said I was lucky my truck was still there. I could tell he didn't believe me about the boots or the mine. I never went back out that way again. I stuck to national forests and designated campgrounds after that. But here's the part that's hardest to explain. 2 months later, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single object, a rock perfectly smooth and round, with 3 shallow notches on one side, like someone had tapped it 3 times with a chisel, just like the noise I heard that first night. I threw it away and moved apartments a few weeks later. I still camp, but never alone, never without phone signal, and never ever near an old mine. Whatever I found out there, or whatever found me, wasn't something I was supposed to see, and I never want to get that close to it again. It was late October 2017 when I decided to take my dog, Rufus, on a camping trip. Rufus was a 6-year-old German Shepherd, lean and smart, the kind of dog that didn't bark unless it mattered. I was living in Richmond, Virginia at the time, working long hours in a warehouse, and I needed a break. Something about cold nights, firewood, and silence had always worked for me. I packed the truck with the basics: tent, sleeping bags, propane stove, canned food, water jugs, fire starter, and a first aid kit. I didn't plan on hiking long or doing anything extreme. I just wanted a spot to sit by the fire, sip coffee, and breathe without hearing a pallet jack beep or someone yelling about inventory. I'd looked over maps for hours the week before and settled on a spot just west of Staunton, Virginia. It was part of George Washington National Forest, but away from the trails most people use. I'd found a mention of a decommissioned fire road that cut off into the hills, and I figured I'd follow it in my truck and then go the rest on foot. No permits needed out there, no campsites, no rules beyond the basics. Just forest. Rufus lay in the passenger seat as we drove, his eyes darting to every tree and movement. It was just us. No cell signal out that way, but I'd left a note with my brother and told him when I'd be back, 2 nights, max. The road became gravel about 30 miles past Staunton. The trees grew thicker, the pavement ended, and the last house I saw was a rusted-out single-wide with tarps over the windows. I kept going. The fire road I'd marked on the map wasn't really a road anymore, just a rutted-out dirt path with deep tracks from some kind of off-road truck. I followed it until I couldn't anymore, parked, and walked. We hiked for maybe an hour and a half. The trees looked untouched. No wrappers, no beer cans, no old fire rings. That was what I wanted. Just forest. I found a clearing on a gentle rise with thick pine overhead and soft leaf litter underfoot. I pitched the tent, set the little camp stove on a flat rock, and cracked open a can of beans to heat. Rufus paced the edge of the clearing, ears perked, then lay down in the leaves with his back to me, facing the woods. The first night was calm, cold but not freezing. I had a fire going most of the evening, fed it with deadfall, and kept my boots on in case the temperature dropped. Rufus didn't move from his spot much, just shifted now and then and looked around. He was alert, but not anxious. That made me feel all right. I turned in early. The tent was barely big enough for the 2 of us, but Rufus curled up by my feet and didn't make a sound. I drifted off to the smell of pine and the distant creak of trees swaying. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that got me, it was Rufus. He was standing. I propped myself up on my elbow and saw him, rigid, facing the tent wall.
No growling, no barking.
Just that full body tension he got when he saw something he didn't trust. I unzipped the sleeping bag slowly and listened. Nothing.
No footsteps, no voices, no rustling.
But Rufus didn't relax. I whispered his name without saying it, just a breath of air, and he turned his head halfway toward me but didn't look away from the wall. After about 10 minutes like that, he finally eased down onto his belly again. Still awake. I stayed up a while watching him, then slipped back to sleep. The next morning, I chalked it up to deer. Maybe a coyote. Maybe nothing. Rufus seemed normal again, trotted around the clearing, sniffed logs, even chased a squirrel a few feet before giving up. We hiked down toward a nearby stream that I'd seen on the topo map. It was about 2 miles off, but the woods were dense and there weren't any paths. I brought a small day pack and the rifle just in case. We reached the stream around noon. It was colder down there, shaded and narrow, the water black and quick. I filled up a couple water bottles with a filter and sat on a rock while Rufus drank. I looked around and noticed something odd about the opposite bank. It wasn't much, just a patch of ground that looked pressed flat, like someone had stood there a while, or squatted. There were boot prints. I couldn't see them clearly from where I was, but they weren't animal.
Straight heel tutu.
I stayed still. I scanned the woods but saw no movement. I told myself it was from a hunter, perfectly normal, but I'd been out here almost a day, and I hadn't seen a single piece of litter or sign of another person. Even animals were scarce, and those prints looked fresh, like within a few hours fresh. I whistled for Rufus and headed back. We reached the clearing around 3. I built up the firewood pile, made coffee, and sat on a log to rest. Rufus lay close to the tent now, more alert than usual, but not on edge, just watchful. I didn't want to spook myself, but I loaded the rifle before dark, just in case. The second night felt different. It got dark fast.
No mon.
Cloud cover moved in. Even with the fire going, The woods looked blacker than they had the night before. I ate quick and stayed outside the tent longer, listening. Rufus didn't want to lay down. He stood facing the same direction for most of the night, southwest, the way we'd come back from the stream. Around 10, I heard it. Not a twig snap, not an animal crashing through brush. It was softer, deliberate, like someone was stepping carefully over leaves. Rufus moved before I did. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just stepped away from the fire and stood at the edge of the clearing. I grabbed the rifle, stood up, and waited. Nothing. I held my breath. I swear I didn't blink for a full minute. Then it stopped.
No footsteps.
No movement. But it had been there. I know what deer sound like. I know what wind in branches sounds like. This was different. It was paced. Human. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up by the fire with Rufus. Every time I dozed, a rustle or crack would bring me back. And around 2, I smelled something. Smoke. Not from my fire. Mine had burned low. This was faint, and it wasn't from inside the clearing. It smelled like someone else's fire. Distant. Dry wood, not pine. Maybe a quarter mile off. I woke Rufus fully, clipped his leash to my belt, and crouched low. We didn't go far, just a few yards into the trees. I turned slowly, trying to catch the direction of the smoke. Then I saw it. An orange flicker through the trees, far off, too far to see who was there, but close enough to know someone else was camping nearby, or squatting. I backed off, eased back to camp, and didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I broke down camp fast. I didn't eat, just packed and left. I had my rifle slung and Rufus on his leash. We didn't talk. We didn't pause. We moved. It was quiet for the first mile. Then, just past the spot where I'd filled water the day before, I found something on the ground that made me stop cold. It was a can. A green bean can. Same brand I'd eaten the night before, but I hadn't left one behind. I packed out every bit of trash. This one was open, drained, and set upright in the middle of a bare patch of dirt, like it was placed there, and next to it prints. Same boot tread I'd seen across the stream. Deeper now, closer, not running prints, not careless, just walking, calm. I moved faster. Rufus stayed close, not pulling ahead. The forest felt too quiet now. Even birds were gone. We reached the truck just before noon, and that should have been the end. I should have driven off and gone home. But something was wrong. On the back windshield, in the layer of dry dust, was a single line drawn with a finger. It wasn't words, just a long, curving shape, like someone had pressed a hand there, then drawn their arm down slowly. No one should have known where I was. I'd taken no roads, parked off the trail, hiked with a map, not GPS. No one but my brother even knew I was out that way. I opened the truck door slowly and looked inside. Nothing was taken. Nothing was moved. The glove box was still locked. But I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A strip of cloth, tucked under the windshield wiper. Dirty, faded green, like an old bandana. I didn't touch it. I backed up, got in, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of Staunton and got signal. I called my brother, told him I was fine, told him I was headed home early. I didn't tell him anything else. For weeks after, I kept checking under my truck. I changed the locks on my house. I watched Rufus constantly. He was the only reason I knew something had been out there with us. He'd known before I had. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone had camped near me? That someone had walked through the woods? None of that's illegal. But I know what I felt. I know when I'm being watched. I know when something doesn't belong. Whoever it was, if it was just one person, they weren't lost. They weren't camping. They were waiting, watching. I haven't camped alone since, and I never go anywhere without Rufus. It was early autumn in 2016 when I decided to go camping alone for a few days. I was 28 then, working as a technician for a medical company in Bristol. The stress of the job had been building for months, and after a project fell through and I'd spent 2 straight weeks troubleshooting night and day, I just wanted to switch off everything and disappear for a bit. I didn't want a hotel or a caravan. I didn't want people around me at all. I just wanted trees, quiet, and the kind of solitude that makes your phone feel like dead weight. I'd been looking online for quiet spots to camp that weren't too far from home and landed on a forested area just outside a place called Newton Abbot in Devon. The place wasn't too touristy, and from what I gathered, it had trails but not many full-blown campsites. That was perfect. I wasn't looking for the comfort of a public pitch or the company of hikers. I had a decent-sized tent that could comfortably fit 2 people, though it was just me going. I packed a thick sleeping bag, a gas stove, enough tinned food to last 3 or 4 days, 2 torches, a penknife, and a small fire-starting kit. I also had an old military-style backpack that I'd used on hikes before, and I spent the better part of a day fitting everything into it neatly. I took 2 bottles of water but also packed purification tablets in case I needed more. I parked my car at the edge of a small gravel road near the tree line. The car park was barely that, just a patch of open dirt where a few logging vehicles must have turned around a few times. There were no other cars when I arrived, which gave me a sense of peace. I locked up, shouldered my pack, and started walking along a narrow track that eventually disappeared into dense woodland. I walked for maybe 2 hours, taking slow, deliberate steps. The forest was beautiful. Everything smelled of wet leaves, pine, and damp earth. Trees were thick and close together, which gave everything a kind of muffled hush. There were birds calling, some rustling in the underbrush now and then, but otherwise the kind of quiet that doesn't exist in cities. I eventually found a small clearing that looked perfect, about 20 feet across, mostly flat, surrounded by thick trees on all sides, and no obvious sign of recent use. No cigarette butts, no ashes, no chopped wood. Felt like a place no one had touched in a long while. I set up my tent just as the light started to dim. Early autumn days weren't too short, but in the forest, the sun disappeared quicker than you'd expect. That first night was uneventful. I cooked up a tin of beans, read from a paperback I'd brought, and lay in my sleeping bag listening to the quiet. I was nervous at first. I think it's normal when you camp alone. Every twig snap feels bigger, but I've always liked that feeling too. The hyper-awareness, the way your ears seem to pick up everything. The second day, I spent most of the time exploring nearby. I took my pack and left a small strip of orange cloth tied to a branch near my tent so I wouldn't lose my bearings. I didn't go far, just walked through trees, climbed over some fallen logs, followed a deer trail for a while, and sat beside a narrow stream for over an hour doing nothing. It was one of the most peaceful days I'd had in a long time. That night, though, something changed. I was just starting to doze off inside my tent. It must have been a little past 11. I had the fire out by then and my torch switched off. I'd eaten, cleaned up, and zipped myself in for the night. It had been raining lightly earlier, so the sounds of dripping leaves and soft wind were still going when I first heard the noise. It wasn't loud, just a sharp crack of a twig. It didn't sound like an animal. Animals are quicker, lighter. This had weight to it, like a boot. It came from the trees on the far side of the clearing. I stayed still, heart kicking up a bit, and just listened. Another step, not close, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the tent. Then nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a boar, though I'd only ever seen one once in the wild. Still, I stayed quiet for almost 20 minutes, ears straining. I didn't hear anything else that night. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I walked around the clearing and checked the ground. There were a few broken twigs, but nothing I could swear was a footprint. It had rained lightly, and the ground was spongy, so it was hard to tell. Still, I had a bad feeling I couldn't shake. I tried to brush it off, told myself I was just spooking myself. But I didn't go exploring that day. I stayed near camp, kept the fire going longer, even propped a few sticks up near the tent's entrance like a makeshift alarm. If anything came through, it'd knock them over and wake me up. That night, I heard it again. A single footstep, then another. This time I sat up immediately, pulled the torch from under my bag, and waited. I didn't switch it on yet. I wanted to listen first. The steps were slow, almost deliberate, and they were closer than the night before. Maybe 15 feet from the tent. Still outside the clearing, still hidden by trees. I felt that knot of fear rise in my chest. The kind that doesn't really let you breathe. I stayed sitting upright for almost an hour, torch in hand, frozen. Nothing more came. Eventually, I switched the torch on and unzipped the tent just a crack, enough to peek out. I swept the beam across the trees slowly. Nothing, just branches and blackness. But just as I moved the light to the left, I caught something. A shape, a man. He was standing perfectly still between two thick trees. I could only see him for a second before he stepped back into the shadows. I snapped the torch in that direction, but it was too late. He was gone. Just trees again. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I packed everything up. I wasn't going to wait around to see what he wanted. I stuffed the tent back into my pack without folding it properly and got moving. I had no idea if he'd followed me out there or just happened across my camp. But it didn't matter. I wanted out. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. Every rustle felt like someone behind me. Every creak of a branch overhead made me flinch. I walked fast, didn't stop, didn't eat. I had no signal on my phone until I was almost back at the car. When I reached the gravel area, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There was a second car there, an old silver hatchback, mud-streaked, dented on one side. It hadn't been there when I arrived, and it didn't look like it belonged to a hiker. No roof box,
No bike rack.
windows tinted, parked at a weird angle half on the verge. I walked to my car and unlocked it with shaking hands, loaded my pack in the boot, and looked around once before getting in. I didn't see anyone, but as I started the engine, I noticed something in my side mirror, a figure at the edge of the trees. He was just standing there, barely visible in the shadows, watching. I didn't hesitate. I backed up fast, turned around, and sped off down the gravel path, kicking up dust behind me. I drove for nearly an hour before I stopped, pulled into a service station, sat in my car, and just tried to breathe. My hands were shaking. I didn't go to the police. What would I have said? That I saw a man standing near my tent? That he might have followed me? I had no evidence, no plate number, no name, just a feeling. But it was a strong one. Back home, I didn't talk about it. I threw the tent in the attic and didn't go camping again for over a year. When I did, it was always in public sites with other people around. I never went back to Newton Abbot. 3 months after that trip, I was reading a news article online. It was buried down the page, one of those small local reports. A man's body had been found in a forest near Newton Abbot. Hiker discovered it. No foul play suspected, but the man had no ID, no belongings except for a set of keys and a crumpled photo in his pocket. The article included a blurry photo of the man's face taken from CCTV weeks earlier when he'd been seen at a petrol station. My stomach dropped. It was him, the man from the woods. He'd been seen walking, alone, carrying a plastic bag. No one knew who he was. His car, if he had one, was never found. I don't know what he was doing in the woods. I don't know why he was watching me. Maybe he was homeless, mentally ill, just trying to survive. Or maybe he wasn't. I'll never know what would have happened if I stayed another night. But I think about it often. The way he stood there, not saying anything, not moving, just watching. That forest isn't far from civilization. But in the middle of it, when you're alone, it feels like another world entirely. And sometimes someone else is already living in it, and they don't want company. I was 37 when I decided I needed a break. Work had been eating me alive, and I'd just come off back-to-back deadlines, most of which bled into my evenings and weekends. I hadn't taken any real time off in almost 2 years. My friends kept telling me to go on a vacation, maybe somewhere tropical, but I didn't want a resort. I didn't want room service, packed beaches, or little umbrella drinks. I wanted silence. I wanted to sit still in a place with no notifications, no alarms, no people. So I packed up my gear and drove to a place I'd only heard about once. An old state park in northern Michigan, not far from the Canadian border. It wasn't a famous spot. I didn't even find it on Google Maps at first. I read about it in a random comment thread on a hiking forum. One guy mentioned it briefly and said it was a good place to go missing for a few days. He was talking about disconnecting from the world, but looking back, that phrasing hits differently now. The park was called White Ash Ridge. No official campground, no maintained trails, just an old dirt road that wound off the highway and ended near a lake. The whole place was surrounded by woods that looked untouched since the 60s. I liked the idea of being off-grid, really off-grid, and this seemed perfect. I printed out a paper map. Cell signal was going to be useless out there, and I left on a Thursday morning. It was mid-September. The trees had just started changing color, and the air was cool in the mornings and warm in the afternoons. I had a 4-day plan. Hike in on Thursday, set up camp near the edge of the lake, read, fish, write in my notebook. No phone, no laptop, just me and the woods. Hike out Sunday. The drive took most of the day. The last hour was slow going on a narrow dirt road that twisted up and down through thick trees and brush. I didn't see another car the whole way. Just a few animal tracks, some rusted beer cans, and a sign halfway up that had been shot through with buckshot. It said White Ash Ridge, no overnight camping. The sign looked like it had been there forever. The paint was faded and peeling, and it hung crooked on its post. I should have turned around then, but I told myself it was outdated. Probably nobody checked it anymore. Besides, I wasn't hurting anyone. Just one guy with a tent, looking to be alone for a few days. By the time I got to the lake, the sun was low. The water was calm, flat like a mirror. I found a nice open patch about 20 yards from the shore. Not a soul in sight. No fire pits. No picnic tables. Just quiet. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and built a small fire with the wood I brought. I sat there that first night, eating jerky and trail mix and staring out across the lake while the sun disappeared behind the trees. I felt calm in a way I hadn't felt in years. The first day was perfect. The second day, I woke up around 7. There was dew on the tent and a thick mist over the lake. I made coffee on my camp stove and watched a couple of loons glide across the water. After breakfast, I walked along the shoreline with my rod and tried a few casts. The lake didn't have much to offer, but I wasn't in it for the fish. I was just happy to hear birds instead of sirens or email notifications. Around noon, I wandered deeper into the woods, following some faint deer trails. I marked trees with orange ribbon as I went, an old habit I picked up from hiking in Maine years ago. I spent hours just exploring. I didn't bring my phone. I didn't need it. I had my compass, a paper map, and enough awareness not to get turned around. I made it back to camp around 4. Still no signs of anyone nearby, just the trees and the lake. I cooked a can of beans over the fire and sat watching the sun go down again. That night was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you realize how much noise you're used to. No distant cars, no planes overhead, just the wind and the occasional creak of the trees. That's when I started to feel something a little off. It was around midnight when I woke up. I don't know why. No loud noise. No nightmare. I just opened my eyes and realized I was wide awake. I stayed still for a minute, listening. The woods were dead silent. Not even a cricket. Not a single leaf rustling. Then I heard the sound. It was faint, coming from the trees across the clearing, maybe 30 yards away. It wasn't an animal. I've spent enough time outdoors to know what a raccoon or a deer sounds like. This was different. It was slow, heavy, footsteps, not stomping but not light either, like someone trying to move quietly but not caring too much if they were heard. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart thumping. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls, but I knew something was out there. I grabbed the small hatchet I kept next to my pack and unzipped the tent slowly. I didn't step out. I just sat and looked. Nothing. The fire had burned down to embers. The moon was bright enough to light up the edge of the clearing, but not enough to see deep into the woods. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. The footsteps were gone. I told myself it had to be a deer. A bear, maybe, though they usually made more noise. Either way, it was gone now. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found nothing. No prints, no broken branches. Whatever it was had moved on. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every rustle in the leaves made me flinch. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Too many horror movies growing up. Still, I packed my gear tighter, kept my knife on me even when I went to wash up near the lake. I spent most of that third day just sitting by the fire. I didn't go hiking again. I just didn't feel like getting too far from my tent. The woods felt different. Not hostile, just watched. I couldn't explain it, but the peaceful feeling I'd had the first day was gone, replaced by something else. Like I was being tolerated, not welcomed. That night, I stayed up late by the fire, just in case. I had the hatchet across my lap, my flashlight next to me. I didn't want to go in the tent until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. It was just after 1 in the morning when I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, a scraping sound. Slow, steady, like something being dragged through leaves. It came from the left, not far from where the woods started. I froze, every part of me locked in place. The scraping stopped, then a crunch, a footstep clear as day, then another. I clicked on the flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. Nothing, just trees, shadows. I stood up slowly, the fire crackling behind me. I took a step toward the edge of the camp, the light shaking in my hand. Still nothing. I stayed out there another hour, pacing in circles, waiting for something to move, but it didn't come back. The next morning, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything that belonged in those woods. I packed everything fast, took down the tent in record time, ate a protein bar and started hiking out by 8 in the morning. I followed my orange ribbon markers back the way I came. I was about halfway to the dirt road when I noticed something that stopped me cold. My ribbons were gone, every single one. I tied them high, above eye level, bright orange, impossible to miss. I'd left a clear trail on purpose, but now they were gone, not snapped off, not shredded, just gone. I stood there in the middle of the trail, my mouth dry, heart pounding. I knew the general direction back to the car. I had my compass, but I hadn't memorized every turn. I wasn't lost, not yet, but the feeling hit me like a punch in the stomach. I started moving faster, checking the trees, the underbrush. I found one ribbon about 15 minutes later, tied lower than I'd left it. It was on a different tree, pointing in the wrong direction. Someone had moved it. That's when it really hit me. I wasn't alone out there, and whoever else was out there, they didn't want me finding my way back. I stopped using the ribbons. I stuck to the sun, the slope of the land, my compass. I walked for hours, my nerves shot, every sound making me whip around with the hatchet raised. I started to hear things in the brush. More footsteps, crunches, snapping twigs, but always just far enough that I couldn't see anything. Always just out of reach. It was nearly sunset when I saw the dirt road. I've never felt that kind of relief. I practically ran to the car, threw my gear into the back, and didn't look back. I peeled out so fast I nearly took the bumper off on a tree root. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station 50 miles south. I sat in the car for 20 minutes before I went inside. That was 2 years ago. I've gone camping since then, plenty of times, but never alone, and never in a place I don't know inside and out. I still think about White Ash Ridge. I never figured out who was out there. A hermit? A hunter? Someone worse? I don't know, but they watched me. They walked around my camp. They dragged something through the woods in the middle of the night, and they tried to get me lost. I was lucky to get out, and I'll never go back. It was the summer of 2016 when I took a trip up to the northern part of Minnesota. I was 39 then, a couple of years out from a divorce I didn't talk about, living in Duluth, trying to piece myself back together with quiet hobbies. Fishing helped, so did long drives. But that week, I needed something that made me feel more alive, or maybe just farther away from the noise of my everyday life. I picked a spot I hadn't camped at before, about 6 miles west of a lake called Portage, just outside a half-forgotten township called Stead. The place wasn't much more than 2 narrow roads and an abandoned grain elevator that leaned to one side. I'd found the location through an old map on a camping forum. It wasn't maintained anymore, but the trail supposedly led to an old fire tower clearing that hadn't been used in over 20 years. It sounded like exactly what I needed. Quiet, remote, and forgotten. I drove out on a Thursday morning. It was sunny and in the mid-70s, the kind of day that makes you forget anything bad could ever happen. I packed my old Subaru with a canvas tent, 2 heavy-duty sleeping bags, a folding table, propane stove, and enough food for 5 days. I threw in a cooler with some cans of beer, dry sausage, apples, and peanut butter. I brought a Ruger .22 for small game, not that I planned to use it, and a bigger hunting knife I kept in the side pocket of my pack. There were no rangers up there, no check-ins. You carried out what you carried in, and nobody came looking if you didn't come back. The drive out was easy enough. Once I got onto the forest road, though, it got rough, overgrown in places, full of loose gravel and potholes. I had to go slow to keep from tearing up my tires. After a while, the road narrowed until it turned into nothing more than a grassy path with tire ruts from someone who must have driven it years ago. Eventually, even those disappeared, and I stopped the car where the forest thickened. I shouldered my pack and walked the last mile in. I reached the clearing around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was just like the forum described. The trees opened up into a wide, flat space where the old tower had once stood. The tower itself was long gone, just the base supports still stuck into the ground like old bones. Grass and wildflowers had grown up around them, swaying gently in the breeze. A small fire pit made of dark river stones sat near the center of the clearing. The ground was flat and dry. I set up my tent facing north, where the tree line dipped into a shallow ravine that must have once been a creek. It looked like the perfect place to spend a few quiet days alone. The first night passed quietly. I cooked over the propane stove and watched the sky turn from blue to purple to black. The stars came out in full, clear and sharp like I hadn't seen them in years. I drank 2 beers and fell asleep listening to the wind rustling through the birch trees. The second day, I hiked a bit farther past the clearing, following a faint trail that ran along the ridgeline. I didn't see any other camps or signs of life. No wrappers, no fire rings, not even broken branches. Just forest. I liked that. That's what I'd come for. I made it back to camp by evening, cooked again, and sat watching the trees. That's when I saw something strange for the first time. It was just a flash of movement. Could have been an animal. Probably was. Something low to the ground, dark. I heard leaves shift maybe 30 feet away. I stood still for a while, waiting, listening, but nothing else moved. I went to bed thinking it might have been a raccoon or something smaller. The next day was hotter. I didn't hike far, just down to the ravine where I found some old boot tracks. At first I thought they were mine from the day before, but they pointed in the wrong direction, uphill, coming from the ravine toward my camp. That put me on edge. I stood there a while, just looking down at the prints. They weren't fresh, but they weren't that old either. Maybe a couple days. I tried to tell myself someone else had camped here earlier in the week. Maybe even a hunter passing through. That night, I stayed up later watching the trees. I kept the fire going longer than usual and ate slowly. Every crack of a branch pulled my eyes into the dark. Around 1 a.m., I saw it again. Movement near the edge of the clearing. This time it was taller. It wasn't a raccoon. It looked like a man, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, barely lit by the dying fire. He wasn't moving toward me, just standing there. I didn't hear him come up, just saw him standing, right where the light stopped. I froze. My hand was on the knife in my lap. I didn't call out. I didn't want to. I just stared. He turned and walked back into the trees like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I packed everything. I didn't take the tent down, just stuffed what I could into my bag. I was ready to leave. I didn't even cook. But when I reached the spot where the trail should have been, I couldn't find it. I walked in circles, trying to pick up the landmarks, but everything looked different in the daylight. I kept my hand near the knife the whole time. I felt stupid, but it felt worse not to. I finally found the trail again after a couple of hours, but something made me stop walking. It was a piece of trash, an old crumpled plastic bag tied to a branch. I didn't put it there. I didn't bring any plastic bags like that. Someone had been there since I arrived, or they'd been there before and just never left. I went back to camp, partly because I didn't know where else to go, partly because I wanted to check if anything had been touched. The tent was fine. My gear was still zipped, but there were two things that weren't right. First, there were boot prints near the fire pit. Same direction, same pattern as the ones by the ravine, but this time they circled the pit twice. Second, there was a short glass, clear, heavy-bottomed, like something from a kitchen cabinet, sitting on the rock beside my stove. It was empty. I didn't bring it. I stood there for a long time staring at it. It wasn't dirty. It looked freshly cleaned. And it was just sitting there like someone had put it down after a drink and forgot about it. There wasn't even a water ring under it, just glass and rock, like it had been placed there slowly, carefully. I packed again, this time for real. I didn't care about leaving the tent. I grabbed what I could and started hiking out fast. I stayed quiet, listening to everything. No branches cracked, no voices, but the whole time, I had the feeling someone was behind me. I reached the car around 4 in the afternoon and drove without stopping until I hit the next town over. Brainerd, I think. I stayed in a motel that night and didn't even shower. Just sat on the bed and stared at the wall. I kept thinking about the glass. It didn't make any sense. A few days later, after I was back home, I checked the camping forum again. I wanted to see if anyone had mentioned that clearing lately, but the post was gone. The user who'd uploaded the map had deleted their account. I tried calling the township office for Stead. They didn't pick up. I tried again the next week, and a woman answered. She said there hadn't been an official trail out that way since 2004, and that they'd stopped patrolling the area altogether because it wasn't safe. Too many old wells, too many wild animals. I didn't mention the man or the glass. I didn't want to sound crazy. It's been years since that trip, and I haven't gone camping since. I still hike. I still fish. but I stay in motels now, or at least in parks where there are other people. Something about that place wasn't right. Not haunted or cursed, just wrong. I think the man had been living out there. I don't know how long. He didn't try to talk, didn't try to steal anything. He just stood there, watched, and the glass. It felt like a message, like he'd been watching me drink from my cup every night and decided to leave his own behind. Maybe it was a threat, maybe it was a joke, or maybe it was just his way of saying, "I've been here longer than you." Either way, I got it. I won't go back. It was October of 2014 when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip in northern Georgia, somewhere along the edge of the Chattahoochee National Forest. I was 29 at the time, working as a freelance photographer based out of South Carolina, and I just wrapped up a few jobs back to back. I needed a break. I figured a weekend in the woods would help me reset. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just space, quiet, and air that didn't smell like traffic and damp concrete. I picked a spot that wasn't on any major campground list, just an old patch of clearing I'd found through an old hiking forum. The directions were vague, but it was near a rough fire road off Highway 60, up near Suches. That area is filled with long stretches of forest, forgotten trails, and old dirt paths people don't really use anymore. The spot I chose was maybe half a mile from the road, hidden in a thick section of trees. No picnic tables, no bathrooms, just raw woods and silence. Perfect. The weather forecast had said the rain wouldn't hit until Sunday night. I planned to leave Sunday morning, so I wasn't worried. I packed a basic one-person tent, a cheap sleeping bag, a lightweight camp stove, 2 days worth of food, and the usual gear: first aid kit, flashlight, knife, spare batteries, and a small hatchet. I also brought my camera in case I felt like snapping some shots. I drove up that Friday, reached the spot by late afternoon, and set up camp without any issues. Felt good to be out there alone. There's a stillness you don't get anywhere else. The air was damp with the smell of pine and wet soil, and the fading sunlight cast long gold shadows between the trees. I made a small fire, cooked some beans and rice, and listened to the sounds of the forest as darkness settled in. That night passed without anything unusual. I slept early and woke up at dawn. Saturday was cool and quiet. I walked a few trails nearby, took some photos of an old beaver dam I found along a creek, and spent the rest of the day relaxing. But around 5 or 6 in the evening, I noticed the sky was shifting faster than it should have. Thick clouds started rolling in from the west, and the wind picked up. I checked the signal on my phone, 1 bar, but enough to get a weather update. The storm had shifted. Rain was coming in early, real early. A flash flood warning had been issued for the county I was in. I should have packed up then and there, but the light was fading fast, and the idea of hiking back to the car in the dark through wet, rocky paths didn't sit right with me. I figured I'd ride it out. I dealt with rain before while camping. My tent was rated for heavy water. I moved my gear inside, pulled the rainfly tight, and dug a shallow trench around the tent to help with runoff. Then I waited. The first drops hit a little after 7. By 8, it was pouring, the kind of heavy southern rain that comes down in sheets and doesn't stop. Wind roared through the trees, and branches slapped each other above the tent like brittle bones. I could hear the river downstream swelling, rushing harder. The ground grew soggy under my tent, and I felt water moving beneath the tarp like it was breathing. I didn't sleep much that night. The storm kept hammering us. I kept checking the corners of my tent to make sure nothing was leaking. The rain kept me company through most of the night, but at some point around 2 in the morning, something changed. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks. You spend enough time alone in the woods and your mind starts trying to fill in the blanks. Every crack sounds like a footstep. Every shadow becomes something else. But this wasn't just sound, it was movement. A real one. I was laying on my side, eyes wide open, listening to the storm, when I felt it. A dull, heavy thud, then another, like someone stepping slowly through wet leaves. Close. It wasn't an animal. I've heard deer and raccoons move through the forest. They're light, erratic, and quick. This was none of that. These were heavy steps, deliberate, slow. Too slow for a wild animal. They stopped maybe 15 feet from the tent. I lay perfectly still. The storm hadn't stopped, but I was aware of every sound outside. Something or someone was standing near my camp, not moving. I couldn't see anything through the rainfly. I didn't breathe. Then, whatever it was started walking again, this time in a circle around the tent. The steps were uneven, not dragging, just not balanced. Like one leg moved differently than the other. It circled once, twice, then stopped directly behind the tent. There was no noise for a long time after that. I had my knife in my sleeping bag. I slid my hand in slowly and gripped the handle. I didn't know what I was going to do if something happened. I just didn't want to be caught with nothing. More time passed, 5 minutes, 10, maybe more, and then the steps moved again. This time away from me, heading toward the woods. I stayed still until I couldn't hear them anymore. Even then, I didn't sleep. The storm went on till morning. When the sun finally came up, it was still raining, but less. Just a drizzle. I stepped out, knife still in my hand, and looked around. I didn't see anything at first, but the ground around my tent was torn up. Deep boot prints, big ones, too big to be mine. They circled the tent twice, then went off east into the woods. No animal makes tracks like that. The worst part, they were fresh, clear, deep. Whoever made them was out there in that storm barefoot or wearing water-heavy boots. I followed them for about 30 feet before I lost them in the wet underbrush. That should have been the end of it. I should have packed up and left. But I didn't. Not yet. I told myself maybe it was a hiker. Maybe someone got lost. Maybe they saw my fire and came to check. But none of that made sense. No one hikes through that part of the forest in the middle of a flash flood at 2 in the morning. And no one walks around someone's tent without saying anything.
No flashlight, no headlamp, no gear.
I didn't cook breakfast. I didn't take photos. I broke down camp in 15 minutes flat and stuffed everything into my bag soaking wet. My boots sloshed as I walked the half-mile back to my car. It was hard to keep from looking over my shoulder every few seconds. The forest was still, too still, like everything was waiting. When I got back to my car, I noticed something that still messes with my head. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. Not wide open, but not closed either. I always lock it, always double check. Nothing was stolen, but my glove box was open. Everything inside was scattered across the passenger seat. Registration, flashlight, tire gauge. I checked under the car, around the trees, behind every stump nearby. No one. Nothing. I threw my bag into the trunk, got in, and didn't stop driving until I reached Allegheny. I never went back to that spot. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe it was just a drifter looking for shelter or some confused hunter. But that doesn't explain the silence. The way they walked around my tent like they were studying it. Or the fact they didn't say a single word. Not even a cough. Nothing. A week later, I went back to the hiking forum where I first found the spot. I tried to find the original thread, but it was gone. Deleted. I messaged the person who posted it. No response. Account inactive. I haven't done a solo trip since. I still camp, but only with others and never that far off-grid. And every now and then, when I sleep in a tent and the wind picks up, I remember that night in the rain. The heavy steps, the silence, and the figure I never saw, just heard. That's all it takes to change the way the forest feels. In the summer of 2016, I was 27 years old. working a dull job at a mid-sized firm in Dublin, and feeling like everything in my life was just on loop. Every weekday looked the same: bus, desk, lunch at the same shop, same coworkers, back home to a small apartment where I'd scroll through my phone until I passed out. I hadn't traveled alone in years, and I didn't have many friends left who'd say yes to a spontaneous trip. So I booked a solo camping trip through France. Just me, a rental car, a few marked spots I'd pinned on a map app, and a tent I hadn't used since college. I landed in Lyon, picked up the car, and spent a few days wandering through little towns and countryside. I wasn't going to the usual tourist spots: no Paris, no Marseille, no Riviera. I wanted the woods, the silence, the smell of trees. I didn't know then how quickly that kind of silence can turn on you. By the time I reached the edge of Parc Naturel Regional du Morvin, I'd already spent a couple of nights camping in random quiet places. Morvin was mostly forested, full of small lakes, and had fewer tourists than other places. I liked that. It felt untouched. It was early September, so the summer crowds were already gone, but the weather was still decent. The days were warm, and the nights dipped into that perfect kind of cool where you could sleep in a sleeping bag without sweating or freezing. That night, I picked a small patch of woods about half an hour from a village called Lormes. It wasn't an official campsite, but I checked a few hiking blogs that said wild camping was tolerated as long as you cleaned up after yourself and didn't make a fire. I parked the car at the side of a narrow gravel road, pulled on my backpack, and walked about a kilometer into the woods until I found a flat spot near a shallow creek. The air smelled damp and earthy. I set up my tent just as the sun was starting to dip low between the trees. After unpacking, I walked around a bit. I had brought a small camping stove, some canned food, a headlamp, and a book. I sat by the creek while heating dinner. I remembered looking at the slow-moving water and thinking how nice it was to not hear cars or voices or phone notifications. That quiet buzz of insects and the faint trickle of the water. At the time, it felt peaceful. It must have been around 9:30 or 10 when I climbed into the tent. The sky had gone black by then. I turned off the headlamp, zipped up the flap, and listened to the wind. I read for a while with my small flashlight, then turned it off and tried to sleep. Took a while to get comfortable. The sleeping pad under me was thin, and every time I turned over, I could hear the nylon of the tent rustling. I think I fell asleep around midnight. At some point during the night, I woke up needing to pee. I checked my watch, 3:12 a.m. I unzipped the tent slowly so I wouldn't tear anything, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside barefoot. The ground was cold and soft. The woods were darker than I remembered. The moon must have been blocked by clouds, or maybe it had set. My flashlight was dim, but enough to see where I was stepping. I didn't go far, just a few meters behind a tree. While I was there, I heard something. Just a snap of a branch, nothing more. I turned quickly with the light, but saw nothing. Could have been a fox or a bird or something dropping from a tree. I stood still for a while, scanning the trees. Everything was silent again. I shook off the nerves, finished up, and stepped back to the tent. Before getting in, I did a slow circle with the flashlight, just to reassure myself. I didn't see anything out of place. Just trees. Just darkness. But even then, I had this weird cold feeling in my stomach, like something had shifted. It wasn't panic, not yet. But it was enough that I zipped up the tent a little tighter and pulled the sleeping bag higher up around me. When I woke up in the morning, everything seemed fine. Birds were chirping. The light was soft and golden through the trees. I had coffee and oatmeal from a packet and packed everything up. I decided I'd stay one more night in the woods before heading further east. I wanted to try another spot not far from where I'd camped, maybe closer to the lake I'd seen on the map. I drove along the gravel road for about 20 minutes before pulling off near a narrow trail that cut into denser woods. This area felt more isolated. The trees were packed tighter, and I didn't see any hikers or cars. I hiked about 45 minutes in, found a clearing with just enough space for the tent, and pitched camp again. That day passed slowly. I walked around, took some photos, ate from my supplies. Around 5 p.m., I noticed something odd on a tree near my tent. It was a deep scratch. 3 parallel lines about shoulder height. They weren't new, maybe a few days old. Could have been an animal, sure, but they looked wide, like from a tool, not claws. I looked around and found 2 more trees with similar markings about 10 meters apart. Something about them bothered me. I'm not a tracker or anything, but they didn't look natural. They looked deliberate. Still, I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe someone had been marking a trail or fooling around with a knife. The woods were public land. I wasn't the only one walking through them. I made dinner and tried to relax, but the quiet wasn't as comforting as the night before. Felt heavy, like something was listening. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises, snaps, rustles, little thumps. A couple times I sat up, heart racing, shining my light out the tent flap. Nothing, just shapes in the dark. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard something that made every hair on my neck stand up. Footsteps, not animal scurrying, not wind. Real, steady human footsteps. They came from the left side of the tent, slow and deliberate. I didn't move. I held my breath. The steps crunched softly on the forest floor, stopped about 5 or 6 meters away, and stayed still. I pointed the flashlight toward the sound and flicked it on. A tree trunk, nothing else. I waited. The light was shaking in my hand. I swept it back and forth, but I couldn't see anything. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the woods were playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew I wasn't. I stayed like that for maybe 20 minutes, frozen. Eventually, I heard nothing else and laid back down, but I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I found footprints. Real, undeniable footprints. Human. They weren't mine. They came from the edge of the woods, stopped a few meters from the tent, then turned back the way they came. No other tracks, just those. The ground was soft, and the tread was deep. They were fresh. I packed up everything as fast as I could. By 9 a.m., I was back in the car, driving fast toward the main road. I told myself I was done with camping, that I'd just stay in a hotel the rest of the trip. Maybe visit a museum, something indoors. But the next day, I got stubborn. I told myself it was just some random hiker, that I was overreacting. I drove north, closer to Avalon, and decided to do one more night. I didn't even go deep into the woods this time, just found a flat spot about 200 meters from the road. The tent was visible from where I parked. That made me feel a bit safer. I slept lightly that night. Nothing happened.
No noises.
No movement. I started to feel like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I woke up, there was something hanging on a branch outside my tent. A piece of red string, tied in a loose knot, hanging right in front of the flap. Not there the night before. I stared at it for a long time, not wanting to move. My heart was pounding in my ears. I stepped out slowly, looking around. No one. Nothing. I didn't pack up. I left the tent, just took my bag, got in the car, and drove. I went straight to a police station in a town called Solitude. My French wasn't great, but I used translation apps and broken sentences to try and explain. They wrote down what I said, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. They said maybe it was a prank. Maybe I misunderstood something. They told me there hadn't been any reports of missing people or crimes in the area recently. I stayed in hotels the rest of the trip. Crowded places near people. I avoided woods. I didn't sleep well for weeks. Back home in Dublin, it took a while for me to stop checking behind me when I walked alone. I got rid of the tent, deleted all my hiking apps. Even now, years later, I haven't gone camping again. Not even with friends. What sticks with me the most isn't what I saw, it's what I didn't see. That someone was there, that they were watching me, that they came close enough to leave something behind on purpose, to let me know they'd been there, and whoever it was, they didn't want to be seen. That's the part that scares me most. They didn't want to hurt me, they wanted me to know they could. I was 31 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the summer of 2019. I just finished a long project at work and felt burned out, mentally fried. I wasn't trying to find myself or anything dramatic. I just wanted quiet, stillness, a few days away from traffic, screens, people, and deadlines. I picked a spot up north in Oregon, a few hours from where I lived in Eugene. It was near Bear Creek, a lesser-known offshoot of a larger river system that fed into the Cascade foothills. The area didn't get much foot traffic, mostly known by old-timers, fly fishermen, and a few off-grid homesteaders. That was what I wanted: solitude. I packed up my old Tacoma with all my gear: a 2-person dome tent, food for 4 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a hatchet, sleeping pad, stove, and a sidearm I always took into the woods. Not that I ever expected to use it. Black bears were around, but skittish. Cougars existed, but avoided people. I had more chance of twisting my ankle or getting caught in a sudden downpour than anything else. I got to the forest road by late afternoon on a Wednesday. The gravel road stretched for miles and hadn't been maintained in years. Potholes forced me to slow to a crawl. Dust kicked up behind me in thick clouds. I drove for almost 40 minutes until the road narrowed into what looked like a half-forgotten fire trail. There, I parked off to the side, just enough to let any rare vehicle pass. I didn't see a single car the entire drive-in. The air smelled of pine, moss, and dry bark. It was hot, maybe high 80s, but under the trees it felt cooler. Everything was green. The forest felt alive but still. A quiet hum from distant bugs, the chirp of birds high in the canopy, and the occasional rustle of wind in the leaves. I threw my pack over one shoulder and set off on foot with a printed topo map and a marked trail route I'd planned out. I hiked in about a mile before I found a slightly elevated flat area above Bear Creek. Nothing fancy, just a ridge with enough space for a tent, surrounded by Douglas fir and a few red alders. The creek ran maybe 200 feet below, and I could hear the steady gurgle of water through the trees. I took my time setting up camp. I pitched the tent near a large tree for shade, cleared the ground, made sure I was away from any widowmakers, and set up my small cooking area on a flat rock. I boiled water, ate a freeze-dried pasta pouch, and sat for a while as dusk came. The silence wasn't total, it never is, but it was full of the right kind of noise. Natural noise. The kind that lets your brain stop bracing for alarms, alerts, and phone vibrations. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag with the tent flap cracked open to let in the cool night air. I was tired but not quite ready to sleep. I read a few pages of a paperback, then turned off my headlamp. Crickets filled the space around me. The breeze made the nylon walls of my tent ripple slightly. I drifted off slow and easy. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to something. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of it. The insects had stopped. No wind, no rustle, nothing. Just quiet, heavy, and unmoving. I didn't panic, but I noticed it. I listened for a while, sitting up slightly. The kind of stillness that makes your skin start to crawl. Not because you're scared, but because you realize how used to noise you are. Then I heard a distant crunch. A footstep. Not an animal. Not a deer. It was paced too slowly. Too deliberate. It wasn't twigs snapping randomly. It was something putting weight down, shifting, moving forward. I reached for the sidearm in the tent pocket and sat perfectly still. I didn't draw it. I just held it in my lap, safety on, finger off the trigger. The steps came from the west, uphill. I couldn't see anything through the mesh flap, just blackness and a vague outline of trees. I waited, heart thudding hard now. The footsteps stopped, maybe 30 feet away, out of view behind thick undergrowth. Nothing else happened. I stayed awake until dawn. By the time the light returned and the birds began chirping again, I was exhausted but not willing to sleep. I unzipped the tent and slowly stepped out. My limbs felt like concrete. I checked the area. No boot prints I could find. The soil was dry, packed hard. But I know what I heard. I debated leaving that morning, but pride made me stay. I chalked it up to a hunter or backwoods hiker. Maybe someone with poor awareness of personal space, or someone camping nearby and wandering at night. Still, I moved my tent further into the trees. Not far, maybe 100 yards east. Just enough to feel like I wasn't advertising myself. That second day passed without issue. I hiked upstream, filtered some water, made lunch near a waterfall I found on the map. I saw 0 people, heard no engines, and picked no sign of anyone in the area. It was like the whole forest belonged to me. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. Not from noise, again, from the lack of it. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like a soft clink of metal, like a tool bumping something hard. It came from downhill, near where I'd camped the night before. I turned off my lantern and crouched silently in the dark. No footsteps this time.
No breathing.
Just a low mechanical scrape. It stopped after about a minute. I didn't move. The next morning, I packed up early and left the tent pitched, deciding to make a loop trail I'd mapped out that would take me about 5 miles through some old logging paths. I took my day pack, left most of my gear behind, and set out just after sunrise. It was mid-afternoon when I got back, and something was off immediately. The tent flap was open. I never left it open. I'm meticulous about that stuff. Bugs, rain, animals. You don't leave a tent unzipped. I walked slowly up, every hair on my arms raised. The inside looked mostly undisturbed. My sleeping bag was still there, my lantern, my notebook. But the sidearm? Gone. Not in its pocket, not under the bag, not anywhere. I tore the place apart looking for it, even checked behind trees, thinking maybe it fell or I'd misplaced it. But it was gone. Nothing else was missing. Not the food, not my boots, not the stove. Just the gun. I stood there in the middle of the clearing, holding the tent flap, breathing hard. My thoughts bounced between total denial and full-blown panic. Who the hell steals a gun but leaves food and gear? Who even knew I was out here? I packed everything as fast as I could. Tent, bag, everything shoved into the backpack. I left no trace, barely even bothered to roll the gear tightly. I needed to move. I hiked the full mile back to my truck in under 20 minutes. Adrenaline did most of the work. As I rounded the last bend in the trail and spotted the Tacoma, my stomach dropped. A man was standing next to it. Not a ranger, not someone who looked lost or friendly. He was just standing beside the truck on the passenger side, arms at his sides, staring at the forest. He had on a long-sleeve camo shirt, a dirty tan hat, jeans, and worn boots. His face was partially obscured by a beard, but what I saw looked empty. Not angry, not curious, just blank. I froze behind a tree maybe 30 yards back. He didn't see me or didn't show it. I waited, heart hammering, unsure what to do. I had no weapon. My knife was in the pack but useless at this range. If I yelled, I had no idea what he'd do. Then he walked to the back of the truck, just slowly wandered over, looked into the bed for a moment, then turned around and headed back into the trees on the opposite side. Not fast, just walked away. I waited another 10 minutes before approaching the truck. I looked around, checked the door handles, the bed, under the tires. Nothing damaged, nothing missing that I could tell. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I drove back down that gravel road without stopping once. My hands shook on the steering wheel the whole time. I kept checking the rear view, expecting to see him walking in the dust behind me. I made it back to town by nightfall. I didn't report it. I didn't know what I would even say. No crime, no name, no proof. Just a man who found my camp and decided to take my gun. But I know I was followed. I know I wasn't alone out there. And I know I'll never go back to that ridge above Bear Creek again. Ever since that trip, I triple-check my locks at night. I sleep with a light on sometimes. It's not because I think he's coming for me. It's because I realize something worse. There are people out there who live in the woods not because they love nature, but because they don't want to be found. People who don't need a reason to watch you. People who will take from you, test you, and disappear like smoke the second you try to understand them. And they don't need to say a single word. It was the summer of 2016, and I had just turned 31. I'd been working long shifts for months at a steel fabrication yard outside of Milwaukee, and after getting into an argument with my supervisor over some nonsense about deadlines, I took a few vacation days. I wasn't interested in anything too complicated or expensive. I didn't want a beach or a hotel or even a real plan. I just wanted to disappear for a while, get off the grid. So I packed up my old gear, bought some canned food, topped off my truck, and drove up north toward the Chequamegon National Forest in Wisconsin. I didn't tell many people. I just said I'd be gone for a while. I wasn't familiar with every part of the forest, but I knew there were long stretches where you could hike or drive and not see another person for days. That was the goal. Somewhere deep enough to feel alone. Somewhere quiet, with no reception, no traffic, no conversations. Just wind and trees and time. I brought my old mutt, Rusty, with me. He was 12 then. Half lab, half who knows what. Loyal, gentle, and never wandered far from camp. I ended up driving almost 6 hours straight. I avoided the main forest roads, going deeper on old logging trails until the trees swallowed everything and the sky felt farther away. I picked a random turnoff, parked in a little pullout where the road narrowed into barely a path, and hiked in for another mile or two. I didn't mark anything. I should have, but I had a decent sense of direction, and I figured I'd retrace my steps. I set up camp in a clearing surrounded by thick pine and birch. No signs of other people.
No rapes, no aschis.
Not even boot prints. Just grass, scattered pine needles, and the smell of moss. The first 2 days were perfect. It was just me, Rusty, and the trees. The weather held. Warm days, cool nights. I fished in a little stream I found a few hundred yards off from camp, cooked what I caught, added some beans or potatoes, and read an old book by firelight. I didn't even hear planes overhead. Just owls, squirrels, maybe a deer or two in the distance. When I lay down in my tent at night, I felt peaceful. I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed until the third night. It started with a strange smell. Around dusk, I was sitting by the fire cooking a piece of trout when Rusty got up, stiffened his tail, and turned toward the trees. I didn't see anything, but he moved slow like he smelled something he didn't like. Then I caught it too, faint but sour, like rot, maybe a dead animal somewhere downwind. I wasn't too concerned. Things die in the woods all the time. I stirred the fire, tossed on more wood, and kept cooking. Rusty didn't bark or growl, but he sat staring into the trees, still and tense. Eventually, I zipped up the tent and went to bed, telling myself it was probably just a raccoon or something. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of snapping branches. Not like a squirrel, but something heavier and close. Rusty was already sitting up at the door of the tent, ears up, head low. I stayed still, listening. I didn't have a weapon with me besides a knife and a little hatchet I used for wood. but I didn't feel threatened, just alert. Whatever it was didn't come closer, but it circled slowly. I could hear the brush moving every few minutes, a snap here, a crunch there. I didn't unzip the tent. I just waited. After maybe 20 minutes, it went quiet. Rusty eventually lay back down, and I drifted off again, light and uneasy. The next morning, I checked around the camp. Nothing obvious. No tracks I could see, and nothing was taken or disturbed. I walked the perimeter, maybe 30 yards in every direction, and found nothing but a crushed patch of ferns and an old branch broken in half. But that could have been anything. Still, the smell was back, faint but there, like wet dog and decay. Rusty sniffed a few spots but didn't act panicked. I chalked it up to nerves and planned to keep the fire burning bigger that night. I stacked extra wood, made some chili, read my book, but I didn't relax the way I had before. That night I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. Sometimes I thought I heard something outside, a soft shuffle, a breath, but it always stopped before I could be sure. The next morning I woke up to find a small pile of rocks stacked beside my tent. 5 or 6 of them, like someone had collected smooth stones and placed them neatly. I didn't do that. Rusty wouldn't do that. And that's when I realized I might not be alone. It hit me in the gut. Not in a horror movie way, just a sick human fear. Somebody was out here. I stood up, turned around fast, and scanned the trees. Still nothing. No movement. Just the weight of being watched. I didn't eat that morning. I packed up my food, dumped the water, doused the fire, and decided to stay alert. I didn't leave, not yet. I told myself it could have been some other camper messing around. Harmless. But I started carrying the hatchet with me every time I walked even 10 feet from camp. Later that day, I hiked a few hundred yards in a straight line, checking to see if I could find any other camps. Nothing. But on my way back, I saw something that stopped me cold. Tied around a tree, about 4 feet up, was a bit of red cloth. It looked like a torn shirt sleeve. Old, weathered, stained with something brown. Not recent, not clean, just hanging there like a marker. There were more stacked rocks underneath it. That was enough. I decided I was leaving at first light. That night I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going strong. Sat outside the tent with Rusty beside me, hatchet in my hand. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Even the bugs had stopped. I kept looking into the dark, trying to listen. Around 1 a.m., I saw movement just for a second. A shape between the trees, too far to make out, but tall. Human. I froze. Rusty saw it too. His ears were up, body tense. But he didn't bark, just stared. The shape didn't move again. I stared for what felt like an hour. Then I heard it again, movement this time behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing, just trees and dark. I didn't go in the tent. I sat up until first light, and as soon as the sky turned gray, I packed everything as fast as I could. Threw gear into the backpack, kicked dirt over the coals, called for Rusty, and we started back. I didn't care about leaving things behind. I just wanted to get out. But here's where it got worse. I couldn't find the trail. I walked back toward where I thought the truck was, retracing the way I came in. But it wasn't there. I backtracked, took another path. Still nothing. I tried to stay calm, told myself I must have veered off a little and would find it. But hours passed. I kept walking. The forest started to look the same in every direction. Eventually, I stopped and sat down. I was lost. I had some water, a bit of food, and a compass, but the trees were so thick that I couldn't see the sun for direction. I didn't have cell service, of course. I thought about building another fire to signal, but I didn't want smoke attracting the wrong kind of attention, not after what I'd seen. Not if that person was still out there. That night, I didn't make a fire. I dug a shallow pit, covered myself in the tarp, and lay next to Rusty. I didn't sleep. All night I heard things moving. Not just one thing, more than one. Sometimes behind, sometimes in front. Once I heard a cough, a human cough, and the smell came back stronger, sharp and wet, like mold, sweat, and filth. I held the hatchet tight and didn't move. I stayed lost for 2 more days. Each day I walked until I was too tired, then stopped and rested in silence. I found the stream again and followed it for miles. I ate what little I had left. Rusty stayed close. On the second night, I found another pile of rocks, and this time something was carved into one. Just a straight vertical line scratched deep. I didn't touch it. I kept moving. Finally, on the 4th day since I first saw that shadow, I came across a dirt road. I nearly cried. I followed it for hours and finally saw tire tracks. Then a truck. I waved it down, and the guy gave me a long look, handed me water, and said I looked like hell. He gave me a ride to a ranger station another hour down the road. I told them I'd gotten turned around, left out the other parts. What could I even say? That someone was out there watching me, leaving piles of rocks and standing in the trees? That someone left an old shirt tied to a branch and coughed outside my tent? I never went back. I never camped alone again. When I got home, I did a little research quietly. I found some threads online, mostly people talking about similar experiences in deep woods. Strange stacked rocks, sightings of people who vanish before they're fully seen, things taken from campsites without a sound. Most people didn't believe them, said it was just nerves, imagination, animals, whatever. But I know what I saw. I know someone else was out there with me, watching, moving at night, leaving things. And worst of all, they never tried to talk or show themselves. They just waited. Maybe for me to sleep too long. Maybe for me to wander farther. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't packed up when I did. I got lucky. No one came looking. No one knew where I was. If I hadn't found that dirt road, I probably wouldn't be writing this. It would have just been another missing person in the woods. Another cold case with no answers. So if you ever feel like getting away from everything, really getting away, just remember, you're never as alone as you think. The forest is wide and quiet, and sometimes someone's already out there, waiting. I was 32 the year I decided to take a solo camping trip deep in the northern part of Arizona. It was late October, and the desert air had cooled down just enough to make camping out there feel more comfortable. The nights were cold, but I liked it that way. My name is Ethan Kelly, and I was born and raised in Oregon, but after living in Phoenix for the last few years, I started to really appreciate silence and space. That kind of silence you can't find anywhere in the city. I planned everything down to the last detail. The plan was to camp out in the Kaibab National Forest for 4 days. It's a huge area up near the Grand Canyon, but I stayed clear of the more popular areas. I found a spot off a service road about 30 miles past the last ranger station. It was out there. I had to drive on a washboard dirt road for a solid hour before I even got close to the trailhead I wanted. I parked my truck behind a thicket of tall ponderosa pines, locked everything up, grabbed my pack, and hiked in. The spot I picked was near a small clearing with a slight slope, and it overlooked this long stretch of ravine where you could see out over the tree line for miles. I set up camp by mid-afternoon. My tent, a small fire ring, a folding chair. I packed light but smart, freeze-dried food, water bladder, bear spray, a knife, a small hatchet, and my old bolt-action rifle. I always carry the rifle when I'm out this far. It's not about fear. It's about being prepared. The first night was fine. Quiet. Almost too quiet. You ever notice how the forest makes noise all day? Birds, wind in the trees, bugs humming. But when the sun goes down, it just dies? All you hear is your breathing, the occasional cracking of branches, maybe an owl. That's how it was. That kind of silence that gets in your ears and makes them ring. I sat up for a few hours watching the fire, sipping from a flask, listening. I didn't see anything strange, didn't hear anything strange, but I had that sense that something was watching me. Not close, just there. Not even fear, really, just a pressure. I chalked it up to being alone and let the fire die out around 10. The second day, I did some hiking down into the ravine. Followed some deer tracks for a while, hoping maybe I'd spot something through my binoculars. Didn't see a thing. I covered maybe 5 or 6 miles total, looping back uphill to the campsite by late afternoon. When I got back, something was off. My tent was fine, nothing missing. My food stash was untouched, but there were marks in the dirt that weren't mine. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, just scuffed areas, like someone had been crouching or kneeling. I checked around for a bit, thought maybe I'd stepped there in the dark the night before and didn't remember, but the position of them was weird, like someone had been beside my tent, not walking, not standing, just crouched and motionless. I felt the hair on my arms rise a little. I even laughed to myself out loud, trying to shake it off. Told myself it was probably a raccoon or some large animal rooting around and I just couldn't see the full prints. Still, I kept the rifle closer that night. The third day, things got stranger. It started early. Right before dawn, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. Not walking, not stomping, just a slow dragging sound, like something being pulled across the dirt and pine needles. I didn't move at first, just listened. It circled the tent, once, twice, then stopped. I waited another 5 minutes, breathing through my nose, clutching the rifle. Nothing. Eventually I sat up, unzipped the tent slowly, and peered out. Everything looked normal in the soft gray light of morning. I got out and checked around. The same scuff marks from the day before, only more of them now. A line was dragged through the dirt, curving around the tent in a wide loop. It was faint, like something had been dragged slowly and without much weight behind it. I followed it for a while, but it faded after about 30 feet, disappearing into the thicket. That day, I didn't hike. I stayed near camp. I made a fire early, cleaned my gear, reorganized my food. I didn't like how the air felt. It was dry and cold and too still. I kept scanning the tree line. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. That same pressure from the first night, only now it was closer. Late that afternoon, I spotted something across the ravine. It was far, maybe 200 yards, but clear enough with binoculars. At first, I thought it was an animal. It was hunched almost on all fours, moving in short bursts. I adjusted the focus and froze. It was a man, but he wasn't walking upright. He was crouched low, knees bent weird, arms long and loose like they didn't know what to do with themselves. He wasn't wearing much. Looked like torn clothes, maybe a shirt or coat shredded around the shoulders. His face was hard to see, but it looked wrong, too long, too pale. He wasn't looking at me, not yet, just moved along the far side of the ravine like he was sniffing the ground. I lowered the binoculars and just sat there for a second. Every part of me was telling me to leave, but I didn't want to rush it. I had gear to pack, miles to hike back to the truck, and daylight would be gone soon. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed inside the tent with the rifle across my chest and the bear spray by my side. I turned off the flashlight, sat in the dark and listened. At some point, I don't know what time, it came closer. I heard branches crack, then silence, then slow footsteps, not boots, bare feet. I held my breath. The steps circled again, slow, deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. Then the breathing started, right outside the tent, just inches from the nylon. It was deep, ragged, wet-sounding. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, slow. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes? 10? More? Then nothing. Just gone. When the sun finally came up, I unzipped the tent and nearly jumped out with the rifle aimed. Nobody, nothing, but the scuff marks were back. More of them, all around the tent now, closer, like it had crawled on all fours, circling me. I didn't pack. I just grabbed what I could, shoved it all into the bag, broke the tent poles, and started hiking fast. I didn't stop. 6 miles straight to the truck.
No breaks.
No food, just kept moving. Every now and then I'd glance over my shoulder and scan the trees. Nothing. When I finally got to the truck, I almost cried. I threw the pack into the bed and got inside, locked the doors, and just sat there for a minute. Then I saw it. Down the road, maybe 50 yards. The same man, standing now, upright, too tall, arms long and hanging, head tilted like he was trying to make sense of me. He didn't move, just stood there. I started the truck, drove. I didn't look back. When I got back to town, I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? That I saw a guy crawling like an animal, sniffing around my tent in the middle of the forest? That he made no sound except for breathing? I Googled for hours that night, found stories, posts on forums, tales of people who'd seen things like that. Some called it a skinwalker, others called it a feral human, or someone who'd lived in the forest too long and lost their mind. I don't care what name you put on it. I know what I saw. I know how it moved. I know how it watched. I haven't been camping alone since then. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but I stay close to other people now. Close to towns, trails, places with cell service and noise. Sometimes I dream about that man, about the way he crouched, the way he circled, the sound of his breathing. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a monster. He was real, and he's still out there, somewhere, maybe crawling through the trees, watching the next tent, waiting for the next quiet night. I'll never forget him, and I'll never go back. I was 29 when I took a solo camping trip in North Carolina. It was late October 2016, just cold enough to keep the bugs away, but not cold enough to freeze overnight. I lived in Greensboro at the time and worked a boring job at a warehouse. I was burned out. Same shifts, same walls, same 4 people talking about the same things every day. I needed to be alone. I needed nature, and I didn't want to talk to anybody for a while. I packed my Ford Escape with a 4-person tent, a small cooler, a couple of freeze-dried meals, water bottles, a hatchet, my sleeping bag, an old fishing rod I barely used, a book I probably wouldn't read, and my camp stove. I didn't bother bringing anything fancy. I wasn't going out there to impress anyone, just to unwind. I chose a quiet, lesser-known place called Rattlesnake Ridge, which was a few hours west. It was part of a bigger national forest, but this area had a small off-road trail that led to an old, unofficial campsite not many people knew about. No rangers, no bathrooms, no picnic tables. Just woods. The perfect place to disappear for a weekend. I left early Friday morning, drove through a couple small towns, and finally reached the trailhead a little before noon. The dirt road into the forest was rough, and at one point I thought I'd get stuck. But after 20 slow minutes, I arrived at a flat spot that opened into a clearing surrounded by thick trees. No one else was around. I parked the SUV under some tall pines, grabbed my gear, and set up camp a few yards from the fire ring someone had built long ago. The air was crisp, the leaves mostly orange and brown, and the ground was dry enough that I didn't worry about mud. The only sound was the rustling of trees and the occasional chirp of birds. I pitched the tent quickly and gathered some firewood. I didn't plan on hiking far, just wanted to relax by the fire, maybe do a little fishing at the stream I remembered seeing down a slope behind the site. It had been years since I'd camped alone, and I forgot how freeing it felt. That first night was peaceful. I made a small fire, boiled some water, and poured it into a freeze-dried pasta meal. It was bland but warm. I drank some water, sat on a log, and stared into the fire. It felt like the first time in months my brain wasn't going 100 miles per hour. I turned in early and crawled into my sleeping bag. The cold air crept through the nylon, but I had layers on and a thermal blanket. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a sound outside the tent. I froze, eyes wide open in the dark, listening. It was just a few slow, deliberate steps, not animal-like, too heavy. Then it stopped. I laid there, holding my breath. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. My heart pounded, but I didn't unzip the tent. Eventually, I heard nothing else. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe a deer. I kept telling myself it was nothing. I drifted off again after a while. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. Everything looked the same. No footprints that I could see, and my gear was untouched. I convinced myself it was a raccoon or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. I shook it off and made some coffee. The stream wasn't far, so I decided to head down the hill and cast a few lines. I didn't really care if I caught anything. The slope was steep but manageable. I slid a bit on some wet leaves but caught myself on a tree. The stream gurgled at the bottom, cold and clear. I saw small fish darting around. I fished for about 30 minutes, caught nothing, then sat on a flat rock and listened to the water. That's when I noticed something across the stream, about 30 or 40 feet away, just barely visible through the trees. It looked like an old tarp, dirty and faded green, strung up between some trunks. I squinted and stood up, trying to get a better look. There was no movement. It was too far to make out details, but it definitely wasn't natural. Someone had set up a shelter over there. The forest was public, so technically it wasn't illegal, but it felt wrong. That wasn't a real campsite. It looked abandoned, or like someone was living there long-term, which wasn't unheard of. I didn't cross the stream. I just watched for a bit. No movement, no sounds. I felt unsettled, and I don't know why. Maybe it was just the unexpectedness of it. I eventually hiked back up to my site and decided to move my tent a little closer to the SUV. Not right next to it, but close enough that I could jump inside and lock the doors if I had to. That afternoon, I kept glancing into the woods while I gathered more firewood. I tried to ignore the feeling that someone else might be watching me. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed and creaked. I kept my hatchet tucked in my belt, just in case. I knew it was probably nothing, but the mind plays tricks when you're alone. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing noises again. Footsteps, maybe, crunching leaves, a faint metallic clink. I stayed still and silent in my tent, holding my flashlight and hatchet. I never unzipped the door. I didn't want to see anything. I figured if someone was out there, maybe they'd just move on if I didn't attract attention. I lay awake for hours listening, stopped eventually, but I was too afraid to fall asleep. The next morning, I got out of the tent and did a slow walk around the site. That's when I found something. A boot print, not mine, too big, and the sole pattern was different than the hiking boots I was wearing. It was just one, near the edge of my site, facing inward. There weren't others nearby, just the one. Like whoever left it was standing there watching me for a while. My stomach dropped. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed up fast, threw things into bags without folding, didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to leave. As I was finishing, I heard something from down the trail, the dirt road I'd driven in on. It sounded like a vehicle. I stood still, listening. After a minute, I saw a dark green pickup truck coming around the bend. It stopped about 40 feet from my SUV. A man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a red beanie, a dark jacket, and jeans. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but he just stood there for a second, like he was surprised to see me. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I was holding my duffel bag. He turned, got back in his truck, and reversed down the trail slowly, tires crunching the dirt. I stood there, frozen. He didn't wave, didn't honk, didn't say anything, just left. I waited a full 10 minutes before I tossed the rest of my stuff into the SUV, got in, and drove. The trail out was rougher than I remembered. Every bump felt worse. I didn't see the truck again, but I kept checking the rearview mirror like a maniac. Once I hit the main road, I didn't stop. I drove until I saw a gas station, pulled in, and sat there with the engine running. I locked the doors and sat for a long time before I got the courage to go inside and buy a drink. I looked around. No red beanie, no green truck. Back home that night, I couldn't sleep again. My muscles ached. I kept replaying everything in my head. The sounds, the boot print, the tarp across the stream, the guy just standing there, the way he left without a word. I kept wondering if it had been his shelter down there by the water. Maybe he thought I'd seen it. Maybe that's why he showed up. I told a friend about it later. He said maybe the guy was just squatting out there and didn't want trouble. Maybe he just didn't like someone camping near his hideout. But I knew something wasn't right. You don't sneak up to someone's camp 2 nights in a row and stand in the woods like that. You don't leave a single boot print unless you're watching someone for a while. I still camp sometimes, but never alone. Never off the trail. Never where I don't have cell signal. I went back once a year later. Just drove past the old trailhead. There was a chain across the dirt road and a faded no trespassing sign nailed to a tree. I never found out who the man in the red beanie was. I never saw him again. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. And I know in my gut I was right to leave. I was 34 when I went on that solo camping trip in Oregon. It was September 2017. I had just finished a long contract job in Portland and needed to get out of the city. I'd been working 12-hour days for months, and everything felt too loud. Cars, sirens, emails, voices, the smell of takeout. I needed quiet. I needed trees, dirt, smoke from a fire pit. I wanted to sleep under the stars and not hear anything but wind in the branches. I chose a small state-managed forest area called Dry Pine Ridge, about an hour and a half southeast of Eugene. I'd found it by accident while scrolling through Google Maps and reading camping blogs. It wasn't a big tourist spot, just a handful of gravel roads cutting through thick woods. The sites weren't official. They were primitive, just flat spaces cleared out under the trees, usually marked by an old fire ring.
No reservations, no fees.
Just drive in, find a good spot, and set up. That's what I wanted. I packed my 2007 Toyota Tacoma with all my gear, tent, cooler, sleeping bag, axe, camp stove, some canned food, water jugs, lanterns, and a few comfort things like a book and my small speaker. I brought my dad's old Ruger .22 rifle too. Not for anything serious, just habit. I'd been around guns since I was a kid, and when you're alone in the woods, it just feels better having something nearby. I never expected to use it. The drive out was calm. I left around 10 a.m., took the 58 out through Oak Ridge, and then turned off onto a narrow gravel road called Forest Route 18. It wound through dense pine and fir trees, the type that cast shadows even when the sun's out strong. I passed a few other vehicles, maybe 3 total. Hunters, I figured. Most people don't come this deep for casual camping. I drove another 15 minutes down a side spur, past a rusted-out mailbox on a post that looked like it hadn't seen a letter in years, then stopped at a clearing that felt right. Flat ground, a circle of stones in the middle, a fallen log I could sit on, and enough space to back my truck in a bit without blocking the road. I walked the area first, checking for trash, looking up at the trees for dead limbs that might fall. Everything looked good, quiet, still, just wind and birds. I set up my tent about 20 feet from the truck, close enough to reach but not right next to it. I stacked firewood, set up my chair, unrolled the sleeping bag inside the tent, then sat back and just listened.
No planes.
No people, just leaves brushing against each other and the sound of my own breath. That first night, I cooked beans and sausage on my camp stove, watched the sky turn gold, and sipped some whiskey by the fire until the stars came out. I slept deep, no dreams, just the sound of my own heartbeat and the cold creeping in around 3 a.m. The second day, I did some hiking along the road, not following a trail, just moving where the woods looked open. I found a small stream and followed it for half a mile. Saw deer prints, bear scat, and a set of boot prints that looked maybe a few days old. That wasn't strange. People passed through. Hunters mostly. No big deal. But I noticed those prints weren't deep. Whoever made them was light, maybe small. Could have been a kid or just someone not carrying much. I didn't think too much about it then. That night, it rained a little, not heavy, just light taps on the tent. I stayed in and read by lantern light. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. Not an animal, just a single noise, like a foot on dry leaves. Then nothing. I sat up, rifle beside me, and listened. No movement, no crunching, no rustling. Could have been anything. A falling cone, a squirrel, even a drop of water dislodging debris. I didn't sleep much after that, but I never heard it again. Still, in the morning, I checked the area around the tent. I walked the perimeter slowly. About 30 feet out, near a tree with a scarred trunk, I saw what looked like a boot print. Faint but there. The tread didn't match mine. It was wider with a different pattern. Not fresh, maybe from last night. Maybe older. I stood there a while just looking, then walked the entire camp. I didn't find any other signs. Nothing missing from my cooler. Nothing touched. I told myself it was old. Probably some other camper from earlier that week. Just coincidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been close. Closer than I liked. I decided to stay one more night, but I moved things around. Put the cooler in the truck bed. Locked it. Placed some noisy items like a pot and my metal mug on the tailgate so I'd hear if someone messed with it. I left my boots by the tent zipper and slept with the rifle beside me. Loaded. That night was quiet again. I woke a few times to normal forest sounds. Owls, wind, one loud crack that sounded like a branch falling. Nothing that made my heart race. But when I got out of the tent at dawn, I noticed something strange. One of the boots I'd left outside was knocked over. Not just tipped, but lying several feet from the other, sideways in the dirt. It had rained a bit again, and I could see the print where it had landed. There were no other prints near it. Just that one, like it had been tossed or kicked. I picked it up and just stood there for a while, staring at it. Something felt off. The woods were too still. I made coffee, sat by the fire, and debated what to do. I still had a day and a half of food and water, but something inside me told me to leave. It wasn't fear exactly, more like pressure, like a weight in my chest I couldn't explain. I thought maybe it was just being alone too long, but I've done solo trips before. This felt different. I started packing up slowly, keeping the rifle within reach. That's when I heard a truck engine somewhere far off. At first, I was relieved, someone else out here. But then I realized the sound wasn't moving. It had started, but it didn't get closer or fade. It stayed in the same spot, maybe a half-mile away, maybe less, just idling. I stood frozen for a minute, listening. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Dead quiet again. I waited another 10 minutes, then finished loading the truck. Before I zipped up the tent, I looked inside one last time and noticed the sleeping bag was slightly unrolled, like it had been moved. I hadn't touched it since the night before. I always rolled it tight and centered it. Now it was off to the side. Not a big shift, but noticeable. That pushed me over the edge. I got in the truck and started driving out. The forest felt different now, thicker. I kept checking my mirrors. Every bend in the road made my neck tense. When I got to the main gravel stretch, I saw something ahead that made me stop. Tire tracks, fresh ones, coming from a side path I hadn't noticed on the way in. The road wasn't official, more like a logging trail. The tracks came out and merged with the main road, leading back the way I'd come. But I hadn't seen a truck pass me, not once. I kept driving. When I hit Route 18, I turned back toward Oak Ridge and didn't stop until I reached a gas station. I went inside, used the bathroom, bought a coffee, and sat there for almost an hour, just breathing, watching the other customers, making sure none of them looked familiar. When I got back to Portland, I unloaded the truck and didn't go through my gear for days. When I finally did, I found something that still messes with my head. In the bottom of my pack, beneath the cooking stuff, was a folded piece of lined paper. No writing, no marks, just folded tight, like a note never written. I didn't put it there. I know my gear. I check every item. I pack light and organized. That paper wasn't mine. I burned it in my backyard fire pit. I haven't gone solo camping since. I still get out into nature, but I go with friends now, always with someone nearby. I double lock everything. I bring more than just the .22, and when I lie down to sleep in a tent, I keep the light on for a while and listen hard. I don't scare easy, but something about that trip stuck with me. It wasn't a monster or ghost. It was a person, someone who watched me, maybe just curious, maybe more. Someone who stood close enough to touch my tent, close enough to move my boot, close enough to leave a blank note like some twisted joke. I think about how easy it would have been for them to do more, to unzip the tent, to wait until I walked into the trees. But they didn't. They just watched. And that's what gets me. That's what makes me lock my doors twice at night. That's what makes me think about going back. Just to look. Just to find that side trail again. But I won't. Some things don't need closure. Some things are better left alone.